Hello, welcome to Mirror Realm. My name's Nick, known as Wyvern on the Discord servers. In today's video, Jared and myself are going to be discussing the deck that we built together for the Midwinter Championship in Australia that Jared piloted all the way to the final. And we're just going to talk about that deck today because it's a completely new deck archetype, and we actually built the deck in just 1 week before the tournament because there was a last-minute rule change that effectively banned roots from being played, and we did have a deck that we had spent a month preparing and that we were really confident in this other deck that also was a completely new deck archetype that didn't exist, but ultimately that last-minute rule change hosed the deck pretty hard, and we decided that we would build another deck just in that last week. And we're just going to talk about the deck and how it all came together. I think just as a starting point, maybe we'll just guess, because we only had 1 week, we did put a lot of time in. What were we putting in? Maybe, 10 hours a day? 8 hours a day?
Yeah, somewhere around that.
8 to 10 hours a day. Yeah, in that week, I think we definitely put in 60 hours, right? For sure, in that one.
Yeah, of actually together testing, but then when we were apart, we were thinking about it all the time.
It's a bit hard to say, it sounds like just 1 week, but it was just 1 week in elapsed time, but in regards to actual time put into it, it was like 60 to 70 hours together at the same time, working on the deck and playing and testing and stuff, but like you're saying, it was also many hours separately each, every single day, thinking about it. Typically what we would start with each day was just a great big conversation about all of the thoughts that we'd both had about the deck. So anyway, it was just 1 week, but it was a very a lot of effort, very intensive, and a lot of effort put into this deck. But I think in the very beginning, so we'll start with what the rules are, because the tournaments in Australia are a bit different and have the meta in Australia is a bit different to the rest of the world because of those rules. The local rules here have Chaos Twister banned and Eric's Curiosa banned. There was a new rule implemented for what was going to be for this tournament, which was that, what was it? I think it was that Roots and Crossroads couldn't be in the same atlas as each other.
Originally it was Crossroads and Roots can't be played in the same atlas. That was mentioned as soon as the rules went up for the event.
Yeah,
almost 2 months in advance.
So we'd done, a whole month, right? And it was hours every day. We did a lot of hours for that month, and we built a deck within that rule set. But then 1 week before the tournament, there was another change to Roots, which was that the mana is removed from your mana pool when you activate the Roots. Obviously, that nerfs Roots pretty hard, and that completely changes everything. The deck that we were going to play was... Well, actually, there was even more than that, right? So, because 1 day before that, they also changed the mulligan rule, which was a big deal for us as well, because we have all of our decks pushing the limits, if you want to put it that way, trying to... When we designed the decks, we're trying to get every single last little ounce.
That mulligan rule just straight up killed 5 of our decks. Yeah. All of our backup decks as well.
Yeah, exactly. So we had built a bunch of backup decks, but we had 2 actual backup decks that we were pretty confident that we could just play when we started building that deck for a month, because we did want to build a completely new archetype of deck. That was something we wanted to do, but before we started that process, we built what effectively were the backup decks, just a deck that we knew that we could play if we couldn't successfully build a new archetype, basically, that was going to be competitive, that we could fall back on. And then the mulligan rule change completely hosed our backup decks. Completely. But luckily it wasn't that bad for the deck that we were actually going to play. So we lost all of our backup decks, but the deck that we were going to play was okay. But then the next day there was a separate change just for the tournament that we were preparing for, to change how Roots work, which also then killed the deck we're going to play. So we were left with no decks at all to play. That were, because even our backup decks were still pretty different, right? They weren't necessarily completely new archetypes, but they were completely new decks.
Yes, and I think a big thing to mention about the Roots destroying mana change also is it killed a lot of decks that would have been good into this deck as well, that we ended up scrambling to make, so this deck wouldn't even be able to exist without like roots going away effectively.
Maybe a version of this deck could exist with Chaos Twister, but not this version. The deck that we ultimately ended up building has Great Old One in it, right? And there's no way that card's in the deck if Chaos Twister exists.
Yeah, especially when no other minions in your deck even, want to be Chaos Twisted.
It is a deck that, well, we are preparing and we're building the decks for the tournament that we're going to play in. I mean, it sounds obvious, but, that includes the rules for that tournament, whatever they may be, whatever cards are banned. And also we're considering things like if draws count as losses, then that's a reason to, which they did in one of the tournaments we played in, that's a reason to not want to play a deck that's too slow potentially, because you might end up with a draw or two, which could cost you pretty hard. So these things are all considerations, the rules are considerations, and for this deck, we knew that Roots was basically no longer, for all intensive purposes, it was just banned, and humbly, in my opinion, it should have just been banned, because it's like you have these two really complicated rules that are just not necessary. Like, it should have just been banned. But for all intensive purposes, it basically was banned. There was no way that a Roots deck was going to win this tournament, and I think any good player realised that. Therefore, there probably was just going to be no Roots decks in the top 8, potentially none in the tournament at all. We wanted to create a completely new deck archetype, but another thing, at least once we realised that Roots was banned, that opened the door for quite a bit. So at that point, we really just had the conversation, are we going to build a completely new deck? Because all of our backup decks were ruined as well. Because trying to build a deck like this was very boom or bust. There was no guarantees that we were going to be able to build a deck that was a completely new deck archetype, that was as cool as this one, that would even work, that you could conceivably have any chance of winning the tournament within 1 week. That's not a given that was possible at all. So we definitely had the conversation about, well, what deck can we fall back on, right? And it was basically just Avatar of Air, right? Pretty much.
Yeah, pretty much.
Roots is a card that keeps that deck in check to some degree. Roots decks are okay against it. It's something that deck has to care about. And it's not that Avatar Air just loses to Roots or anything. It's actually, it can compete for sure. But any deck with Roots effectively has a free out, an extra free out versus getting Maddening Bells on them. They can blow everything up. So whatever outs they have one extra out because they have Roots, right?
Yeah.
And good Roots deck would be able to, whatever they do they would be able to recover faster than the Avatar. Like, at the end of the day, Roots is something that every deck has to care about, including Avatar of Air. With that gone, Avatar of Air was just the best.
Yeah, we already had it as being, probably the best deck. And then, but Roots was, up there with it. And then all of a sudden Roots is gone. So it's like, do we just play what we consider probably the best deck and just not be creative? Or do we just bunker down in this last week and really try and get there and make a new deck? And, well, realistically, we just went back to a card combo that I've been saying is really cool and possibly overpowered for quite a while, which is Philosopher's Stone Replication. And we managed to make it work.
Yeah, and if you look at the FAQ for Philosopher's Stone, so there's 2 key combos in the deck. So there's a replication with the Philosopher's Stone, but there's also effectively the dropping and picking up of the Philosopher's Stone.
Yeah, without that, it wouldn't be anywhere near as ridiculous as we made it.
If you look at the FAQ on the website of the Philosopher's Stone, there is literally only 2 questions on the FAQ, and one of them is, if you have 2 Philosopher's Stones, i.e. example via replication, do the effect stack? Yes. And the other one is, if my avatar has Philosopher's Stone and casts an air spell, and then they drop it, and then my Apprentice Wizard picks it up and casts an air spell, do I get the discount again? And it's yes. The fact that only 2 questions exist on the FAQ for Philosopher's Stone, and they are effectively the 2 that this deck is built around, it very much feels like this is something that they wanted somebody to build a deck that utilized these mechanics, because if they didn't, why would they have put them on? Why would they be the only 2 things on the FAQ?
Yeah, for sure.
So it's clearly something that they wanted people to do. There's other things that they clearly wanted people to do. I think another example of this would be Nimbus Jinn Combo, to draw a bunch of cards and discard them, because if they didn't want people to do that, why would they make both Summoning Sphere and Evil Presence? Why would they give you multiple options to drop it directly on top of them if they didn't want that combo to exist? Like, they clearly wanted... And also, they made Nimbus Djinn Elite instead of Unique. Like, there's so many things that if they didn't want people to do that combo, then Nimbus Djinn could be unique and they wouldn't have multiple options to drop it straight on top of them. I think it falls a little bit into that bucket where it's clearly something they wanted people to do. It's just that nobody had done it yet.
Yes, I think so too.
But there's also a bunch of other interactions in this deck, and I guess where did we start? We basically had a previous deck that wasn't this deck, but it had quite a few of the interactions that this deck has.
Yeah.
That
so it was like
that was with Elementalist, right?
Yeah. So it was like the stone with replication and the eggs, and then just a bunch of, like, we had Island Leviathans with Wrath of the Sea. That was another part of the combo, and it started out as Elementalist, and then eventually we just moved to Deathspeaker just because it's the raw power of it. It's just, you get too many extra cards out of it, basically. And we just fixed the mana base in other ways.
That was a start point, though, right? Like, we went back over the previous decks that we had scrapped, basically, right? Was the first thing we did.
Yeah.
So the first thing we went back over everything, and we looked at all the decks we scrapped and why we scrapped them. And then we pulled up this Elementalist deck. And the main reason we scrapped it was that it just couldn't beat Roots. It just couldn't beat Roots. So we just scrapped it and moved on. Yeah, obviously it had a bunch of other issues, but because it just couldn't beat Roots and there was just no real way to change it to allow it to beat Roots, it just got scrapped, went on the scrap heap. But then now we just pulled that up and we just looked at it and we thought, it's a water-based deck that has super cool stuff going on. Let's just go for it, pretty much, right?
Pretty much.
Let's just take that as a template and let's just make it work. And then, as you're saying, it quickly morphed into being a Deathspeaker deck so you're basically losing the mana fixing, and you're gaining the raw power of the Deathspeaker, which is, I mean, probably just the best avatar in the game as far as raw power level is concerned.
Definitely up there.
There's other cards that are so cool with Deathspeaker that no one ever played, pretty much, in any decks, that seemed really good with Deathspeaker that we wanted to put in the deck list. So that's one thing. Like, there was cards that are like really powerful with it that are commonly played, but there were even more cards that nobody was playing with it, mostly because they're water and nobody played water. We wanted a deck that was primarily water based, or water was at least a big part of it. We looked at the Great Old One and we were just like, we got to play it. That's got to be in the deck. It's like, nobody plays it. 16 power. It's absolutely huge and it's crazy good, and because there's no Chaos Twister, you can play it in the deck, and pretty much never came out, right? Like,
yeah, no, that was always in. It's like, this card's so cool. And it's just like, flooding the whole realm is really powerful. It's just time to play it.
So
if not now, it's never getting played.
Yeah, exactly. I think, I don't know, it's really hard to talk about this deck. Let's just try this. We'll just talk about specific sets of cards. So I think a big thing here is the replication. So let's start with that, and let's see what rabbit hole that leads down. The first thing is, obviously, that you can replicate the Philosopher's Stone, and you get the multiple discounts. If you're holding a Philosopher's Stone, you can replicate an artifact that you're holding. So you get a second Philosopher's Stone, and then each unit can, once per turn, drop any number of artifacts they're holding, and separate to that, have an action to pick up any number of artifacts they're holding. So a lot of people will be aware of this interaction, but what it basically means is that if you have, say, an Apprentice Wizard where your avatar is, your avatar, if they potentially have 2 Philosopher's Stones, they could cast, say, a Vile Imp. That'll cost nothing. They just need the 1 fire threshold. And they could cast an Apprentice Wizard, let's say, and that will cost 1, because it's 3 discounted by 2 to 1. So you cast the Apprentice Wizard, and then after you cast the Apprentice Wizard, you could drop the 2 Philosopher's Stones and have the Apprentice Wizard that you just cast pick them both up, and now you get to have the Fire in the Air discount again, basically. That's a pretty normal thing for this deck, that you cycle through them all and then you go back to where it started. Your avatar will pick them up at the end. Another thing that's pretty common is that what we quite often don't do is use up all the discounts for the avatar at the start. Like, it gets passed on pretty quickly, and then it comes back around at the end and you can use up the remaining discounts they hadn't used yet at the end.
While you're doing that, you end up drawing quite a few cards, and then you end up getting the next replication, and quite often you'll end up with 3 Philosopher's Stones, a bunch of wizards, and they're all casting multiple other cantrips like your mermaids, and they all chain into each other. The turn you play the stone in the first replication, you'll normally draw maybe 10 to 15 cards, and then the next turn you'll pretty much always draw the rest of your deck.
Yeah, which is a big deal because there's a lot of one-offs in this deck that solve specific problems, like the Disenchant, for example, but it doesn't matter, so like you don't need to tutor for it as such, you just need to draw your whole deck, and then you have it as well.
Yeah, who needs common sense when you have your whole deck in your hand?
Yeah. But that isn't the only way that the deck wins, right? Because obviously there are those games where you just don't draw the Philosopher's Stone, right? So you, like...
Absolutely.
And that's, the princess is in the deck to fetch it, but you might also not draw the princess. And there are some games where you may obviously draw a replication or even two replications before you've got the Philosopher's Stone. That can totally happen. So there is another path with the Angel's Egg to be able to just replicate Angel's Egg, because you can potentially have 4 Angel's Eggs that can all easily be submerged as well. Because you have so many water sites and you have so many submerged minions in the deck. You have frogs and you have mermaids. It's pretty easy to get them beneath a site, and there are very few decks in the game that can do anything about that. So any artifacts that you have submerged are basically, well, the main threat to them is actually roots.
Yep, which is why all of a sudden this became very strong.
So you have potentially artifacts. Now all of the cores in the deck, they will still provide the mana every turn, even if they're held by a frog that's submerged. And you typically want the Manuscript submerged on something as well. So the only artifact that you actually sort of need in this deck on the surface is the Philosopher's Stone, because it does need to be held by the spellcasters. But there are games where you can have like a frog on the surface and a frog submerged, or a mermaid or whatever it is, and they actually rotate every turn. So like a frog will bring the Philosopher's Stone to the surface, drop it, and it'll be picked up by your spellcasters, and at the end your spellcasters will drop it, and then another frog that started the turn on the surface will pick it up and then submerge with it. It's not something that happens every game, but it is something that occasionally happens, that you can also fully protect your Philosopher's Stones as well, using that, hiding them beneath in the water effectively. But the replications, there are many decks that if you just have 2 or 3 or 4 Angel's Eggs, combined with the fact that you're just drawing so many cards and you have so many blockers, they can never win. They can never do that much damage.
Yeah, that's how I won my first game of the tournament. I just had 3 Angel's Eggs underwater, and it was over.
And you get to basically draw your whole deck, not because you drew it all in one turn, but just because you drew it all in 7 turns, and they couldn't kill you in all those turns. It's obviously something that is extremely powerful in some matchups, and not that good at all in other matchups, where they can just do the 20 damage in one turn.
It's an alternate win condition against any deck that doesn't basically one-shot you, which is, other Jinn Combo based decks is a big part of it.
You can also, it doesn't feel bad if you just replicate a core either. Like that's another thing that you can just do.
Sometimes you can fix your thresholds with it, but mostly it's about getting another Aquamarine Core for getting the Island Leviathans on earlier.
Yep. And this, in particular, this deck, it's not playing a site every turn because it doesn't have the Earth and the Land Surveyors. You do typically want to be drawing spells. It's giving you an extra mana that the mana it's more valuable in this deck, 1, because you play less sites, and 2, because you potentially end up with multiple Philosopher's Stones. So 1 extra mana can potentially end up meaning that you're casting a whole extra Apprentice Wizard or something. But because if you have double Philosopher's Stone, 1 extra mana potentially means that you get to cast a spell that costs 3, kind of thing. So
and if it's a wizard, then all of a sudden they're chaining into more spells and more spells and.
Yeah, so there's a point there somewhere. I think the point is just loosely that 1 mana to this deck is more valuable than 1 mana to the average deck. Something like that.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Just for those 2 reasons. 1, because you potentially get all of these double, triple, quadruple, quintuple, I don't know, sextuple, whatever it is, you potentially ending up with so. There are turns where if you add up all of the discounts that you had, it's it's over 30 mana. It's even over 50. Yeah. Sometimes.
Yeah, easily.
So the fact that if you just having 1 extra mana that can mean come the end of all of that, you won the game versus fell 1 mana short. That's one reason that it's so valuable, just because once you get rolling along in your combo, just that 1 extra mana can really help, just not falter. But then also, like, just because you play less sites compared to the average Deathspeaker deck, it helps with that. So really the only target in the deck that you're not really ever replicating is the Manuscript. So there's 7 good replicate targets. It is possible you end up with a replicate early and nothing to replicate, but I think it's more
that there's 1 incredible target, 2 very good targets, and then 4 like decent targets to replicate.
And the 1 incredibly good target is sort of 2 because of the princess. You have an extra way to get You have an extra way to get it. Yeah, but quite often there is a choice there, really. Like, we're saying it is okay, it is acceptable to replicate a core, and quite often you will just do that. But it is ultimately a choice when you have the replicate and the core that you could replicate, or do you hold on to it and wait to see if you get a stone? That's actually a choice when you're playing the deck. It's not a given that you will just replicate the core.
Yeah, I think that choice mostly just comes down to time. Do you feel pressured that you need to be doing stuff and get on the board, or are you playing like against more of a slower matchup and you just have time to wait for the stone and then actually go off?
So I guess we'll just roll into, because we talked about the wizards a bit and the dropping and picking up the stones, so maybe that makes sense to roll into the wizards. So there's 4 apprentice wizards and 2 grandmaster wizards. Now arguably if there was some other wizard that drew cards, that might be in the deck, but there isn't, so it doesn't matter. There's all the wizards there can be, pretty much. And
yeah, the only other wizards that we were considering was the 2 power one who goes and gets his other copy.
Yeah.
Actually get the name of that guy.
Adept Illusionist.
Yeah, so the only other card we were thinking about was that first spellcaster was Adept Illusionist. And they were pretty decent, but I think the fact that they didn't cantrip, like the turn you played them, was mostly the reason we didn't play them. And Space is at an absolute premium in this deck.
Yeah, I mean, and in the end, just pretty much nothing, like, yeah, because of that premium, it really is like every card is either like helping you roll through the various combos, or it's doing something that you desperately need it to do. The Adept Illusionist just wasn't doing something that you desperately needed it to do, and it wasn't helping you roll through the combo, basically. So the wizards, because they're spellcasters, they effectively are picking up the Philosopher's Stones, and when you have multiple of them, as discussed, like it's quite often the case that you will, by the time you've passed on the stone to a wizard, and you've potentially cast 3 different spells that are potentially all triple discounted each, by the time you've drawn all the cards off the back of that, you probably have drawn another wizard that you can play for free, and then pass the stone to them and do it again.
Yeah, most of the time the only wizards you need to actually pay for when you're comboing out are the Grandmasters, and they cost 3, but they still draw 3 cards. And another big thing to mention is the Selfsame Simulacrums in this area, because they do double up as wizards almost every time. Like, it's very rare that you don't play them on at least an apprentice wizard.
Yeah,
Grandmaster obviously the optimal target. And when you're comboing out, they only cost 1 as well, is a big part of it. So they actually...
they cost 1, draw 3 cards, because they're probably copying a Grandmaster Wizard.
Yeah, and then get a bunch of discounts.
And they get a bunch of discounts, yeah. So they basically give you 3 cards and 9 mana, and they cost 1. Which is just totally crazy. They are a card that just feels so ridiculously insane in this deck. It's almost like, how has no one ever included this card in a Deathspeaker deck before? It feels so good.
Yeah. Absolutely.
It feels so good.
Down to, like, they are double threshold, but most of the water Deathspeaker deck, they all still play Atlantean Fate, so they do stretch their mana base enough, but maybe they just didn't know about the interaction with that you could actually death deal, or like your Selfsame from the graveyard with them, or
it just feels like it feels like maybe everyone just went onto the card search and typed in Genesis, and unless it's on the list, they're not allowed. It's just completely like.
It does feel like a
complete oversight. Like, it feels like a massive oversight, because the card is absolutely insane.
A big thing with the Selfsame themselves is most of the time you can just jam them on turn 4, have them trade out with whatever your opponent played, because you just copy that, and then they're like a really good flashback target when you have a wizard in play as well, because they're like so much cheaper than actually flashing back a wizard themselves.
Yeah, so, the utility.
They have so much more raw card draw power.
Yep.
And they're also expensive as well when you need them to be.
Yeah, well, the utility's crazy with them. Like, they can...
Absolutely.
The fact that they're effectively some kind of like pseudo removal if you play them on turn, say as your 4-drop, but that could potentially easily be on turn 3 or like on turn 3
yeah,
for sure. So it's buying you some valuable time, which in this deck, one extra turn, I mean, it's true for every deck, but in this particular deck, one extra turn is easily the difference between winning and losing.
Yeah, one extra turn in this deck could be the difference between drawing another 20 cards or not.
So the fact that they can quite comfortably just buy you a turn because they can trade for something, whatever your opponent has, you just copy that and just trades for it. But also just copying a Grandmaster Wizard. And then also you can Fey Changeling the Simulacrum for free, potentially, when you have the triple discount right, and then you replay the Simulacrum for 1 to recopy. It's just, the Simulacrum, I don't know, it feels like the best, like, I get that it doesn't fit every deck, especially if you don't have the water thresholds, but it feels like the best possible Deathspeaker card that could ever exist, almost. Because it literally is copying anything, right?
Yeah. I mean, you need the good targets, but, the good targets exist, so... And there's so many good targets as well, so... And
then it also has the utility of the fact that it can copy anything. There's just all sorts of opportunist game states that can occur, where it can just do something as well. Like, it just feels so incredibly good, and it's just so... I don't know, it's almost unfathomable how it's just not on any death. Like, how does it not exist? How did it not already exist?
It seems like it was such an oversight, like, that during our testing of it, like, we saw it and we were like, this seems really strong, and then we had to actually get a rules check to see if it even worked, because we were like, maybe it doesn't work, and that's why no one's using it. But yeah, it turns out, no, it works, and it's incredible.
Yeah.
Like, it felt so overpowered when we first started testing with it that we actually thought it
it just didn't work with the rules.
You must not be able to do it by the rules.
Yeah, so, I mean, if no other takeaway from this, the takeaway is Simulacrum with Deathspeaker is, like, absolutely insane. Like, if you have the targets, but there is no Deathspeaker deck that doesn't have the targets. That's the thing.
Yeah, exactly. So the targets exist.
It's hard to know where to move next, but let's just move. We have to do a bit of a side shift regardless here, it feels like. So let's just move to the Deep Sea Mermaids, just because, well, I think a lot of people would just view them as, like, they're just there because they're like 4 extra apprentice wizards that are not as good because of the double threshold and because they're not a spellcaster. But actually, in this deck, it's not that they're not as good. They're different. They're definitely different. Yeah. They give you something completely different, something that's incredibly valuable that the wizard doesn't give you. And this deck, so there's 2 things. So one, we'll start with the easier one, which is the Submerge.
Submerge, yeah.
Which
the Submerge is so good that, like, I literally went through every card in the game to find more things that had Submerge to try and get them into the deck. But yeah, we just, at the end of the day, we had to trim most of them. But yeah, Submerge is really strong in this deck.
And that's because you can just cast all of these artifacts to the subsurface, other than the Stonians, and protect them.
They just feel safe.
And they can't do anything about them.
Yeah,
they're completely
safe. You just feel really safe when you have multiple Angel's Eggs underwater, or even just all your mana base is underwater, and you just you're not having to worry. You can just jam all of them. You don't have to consider anything.
So Submerge is absolutely huge. The other thing that's absolutely huge for this deck is drawing from the bottom of your deck instead of the top is not some insignificant difference. It's an absolutely massive difference in this deck, and the reason for that, well, there's 2 reasons. So one is the mulligan at the start of the game, and the other is browse. So we'll start with the mulligan at the start of the game, and it's a big deal for deciding your starting hands, especially if there's a mermaid in your starting hand, because you can put the spells from your starting hand onto the bottom of your library, and you get to choose the order that they go onto the bottom, and then you will know the exact cards that are on the bottom, and then when you play your mermaids during the game, you're going to draw them from the bottom. So a big thing about playing this deck, absolutely big thing, and this is where we start to get into why this deck is so difficult to play. And one of the big reasons is, one, you have to remember all the cards you put on the bottom of your deck and the order that they're there. And two, you really have to, at the beginning of the game, even if you don't have a mermaid in your hand, the order is still super important. You need to have the foresight to see which cards you might need at what points in the game and in what order. And that's just a huge part of this deck, and it's hugely valuable when you know, for example, that like you have a mermaid in hand, and let's say the bottom card of your deck is a Poison Nova or something like that. The fact that you can play the mermaid and then the next turn you get to play the Poison Nova, that's a huge deal in regards to playing out the game, and knowing that you just need to put some chump blockers, stall a bit, and then you can clear the board. Versus,
even if like in your opening hand you have like the mulligan and you have like your combo pieces, but you don't need them yet. You can just store them on the bottom and then get them later when you need them with mermaids as well.
Yeah, exactly. But also there's so many different combo pieces, right? So choosing the order that they go on the bottom is huge, right? And remembering what's on the bottom is huge as well. But it's such a big decision getting that order right when you put the cards on the mulligan at the start of the game. But it's also, so that's one big thing. But the other thing that's just absolutely huge, and it feels like another completely, the power level of this interaction seems absolutely insane, which is Brows and Mermaids together seem absolutely insane, because you get to look at the next 7 cards and put one in your hand, but then the other 6 you put on the bottom in any order, and then you can get whatever ones you want out of the other 6 in whatever order you want with the Mermaids, which is huge to be able to look at the next 7 and take any number of them that you want in whatever order you want, effectively. And and again, it's another big thing, right? Like, the power of that interaction is huge, but also it's like really intense understanding when you're looking at those 6 cards that you're putting on the bottom, especially if it's an early game browse, and getting that order correct for when you will need those cards is a big deal.
Such a powerful interaction and such a big deal that like we tried to cut every shuffle effect from the deck that we could. The only one we couldn't cut was Princess because he's so strong. But yeah, that interaction is so powerful. Just even the extra knowledge of it, you know, just changes the way you play the whole game out.
Because there's so many one-offs in the deck as well. So if you know, like you're saying, just knowing, for example, that the Nimbus Jinn is, you know, the 3rd bottom card in the deck or wherever you put it, and knowing that you're not going to draw it until then, especially if you've already played the Princess before that. So there's not even any way to put it anywhere else in the deck, right? Like, that's just where it is. It ain't going anywhere. It's the 3rd last card.
Yeah.
Which is huge. And then obviously with the Deathspeaker, the 4 Mermaids is kind of like 8 Mermaids, and with the Simulacrum it's potentially like even more Mermaids, right? Like, it's not like you're limited to only being able to do that effect 4 times in the game. Between the Mermaids and the Fey Changelings to bounce them, and the Simulacrums to copy them, and the flashback for everything, you can draw any number of cards really that you want from the bottom of your deck. There are certainly games where you would do that more than 8 times in one game, for sure, that effect.
Yeah.
Even when a card is like the 6th last card that you're buried down there with the brows, there are even games where you actually draw that. Like, it's possible you can draw that back up. I mean, the other important thing when you're putting them on the bottom as well is that the 6th last card is also the first card that you're going to draw without the Mermaids.
Yes.
When you're comboing through your deck.
Because you do draw so much of your deck, and some games you don't draw your whole deck, and you might only be missing 3 or 4 cards. So even the browse order, you know, for the top cards matters, because you do get to them.
I mean, I'm trying to harp on here, but it's very, like, of all the decks we've ever built and ever played, this was by far the one that, I don't know if hardest is the word, it certainly was the hardest, but it's not necessary. It's like, it's the one
that, like, the most draining to play. You're always thinking every turn, like, so many steps ahead, and you have to do like so many calculations between your mana, what you can possibly draw, what you can play, your droppings, your pickups. It's a hard deck to play.
Yeah, and you're often choosing between stuff like, right, like, are you going to play you play, like, especially the 3-drop, it feels like that's always a big choice, whether it's a wizard or a mermaid. If it's a mermaid, is it submerged? Is it a egg? And it feels like the game can play out very differently depending on which choice you made there. If the mermaid was on the surface or submerged, or if it was a wizard, or if you played an egg and you're just going to play the egg on the surface and maybe they can get rid of it. And between that and even just your mulligan cards at the beginning of the game, the order that you put them on the bottom of your deck can potentially win or lose you the game just because you put them in the wrong order. If you forget the cards
what you put down there, or you forgot that you played a princess and you shuffled them away and you expected to draw something as well.
Just constantly remembering everything, the order of everything, trying to forecast all of these turns in advance, and all the discount, like the mana calculations are way more complicated once you got a Philosopher's Stone in particular, and you start getting all these discounts, and can they kill that wizard or not? If so, you're not going to be able to pass it and get like I don't know, it's really like it's like your brain is just working like in 100% power for the duration of the entire game. And if you just lapse at any point, you can just lose.
Yeah,
really.
Yeah, well, that's how I lost Game 3 of the finals, pretty much.
It just takes one momentary lapse, and that can just be forgetting the 6th last card of your deck, or you're saying, like, even worse than that, forgetting that you shuffled the thing with the princess. Like, there are just these lapses that, like, or you mulligan these 2 cards at the beginning of the game in the wrong order, you put the wrong one on the bottom, and that just loses you the game. Like, even
the other thing is, like, when you mulligan, it wasn't even clear that they were the wrong order, right? And they could have been objectively the right order, but the game played out in such a way that you needed the other card that you mulliganed, not the one that you mulliganed and drew, sort of thing. So it's definitely, you have to think a lot of turns ahead in this deck as well.
And I think it's just because every game at its core, like, realistically, right, like, yeah, there are a game where potentially you just have 3 or 4 Angel's Eggs and they can't do anything about it, but on the most part, that's just not how the games play out. The games play out in such a way where you win or lose within one turn. Whenever you lose, probably you're going to win if you just lasted one more turn.
Yeah.
And whenever you win, you're probably going to lose if you didn't win that turn. Half the time when you win, if you didn't win that turn, you may have lost. Like, it's close. The reason why all of these things matter so much is because if you do any of these things wrong, potentially you're one turn slower, and then potentially you lose, right? But those potentiallys are not like there's a 1% chance or a 2% chance or a 3% chance that you make a mistake and you lose. It's like one semi-minor mistake, like forgetting the order of the cards on the bottom of your library. That manifests itself into the chance of you losing extra because of that. It's not 1%.
Yeah, it's like a cascading effect where like everything just changes throughout the whole rest of the game because you made that one decision and then you potentially just lose because of it.
So the mermaids are, that interaction with Browse though, absolutely, I don't know if broken is the word, but because there's lots of...
It definitely pushes Browse from like being very, very good to just like that next tier up of just like...
Yeah, one of the most insane cards in the entire game. Like one of the most powerful few cards. And I think mermaids are just, as far as Deathspeaker is concerned, because they can flash back the mermaids or whatever term you want to use to cast them from your cemetery again. And again with the Simulacrum, the change, like, it's such a strong interaction. It's such a strong interaction that any deck that plays Browse and mermaids can take advantage of. But it's extra powerful in Deathspeaker just because it gets to cast the mermaids more times, right?
Yeah, correct. And the submerge factor is not to be underestimated either. Like, submerge is... There's not many creatures that have submerge that are also good and playable. Most of them are barely junky, so it's hard to get them in. And submerge is super good when you have things you want to protect. And maybe that changes if like water becomes like much more in the meta and people can actually fly underwater to go and get your stuff. But at the moment, that's definitely not the case.
I mean, and also all the water stuff just generally is like, because Root Spider is always a consideration for us because the card is so powerful. So obviously, just playing a lot of water stuff just generally is pretty good against Root Spider.
Yeah, I definitely played a lot of games where at the tournament where there was just like a Root Spider on their side of the board, and all it was doing was just locking down a Fey Changeling because they just had no other options. They couldn't come to my side. It was just chilling.
I guess we'll just quickly talk about Fey Changeling before we move on, because we've mentioned it a few times.
It's incredible in this deck. You need the early defenses, and Fey Changeling definitely covers that. But then it also goes from being a defensive card, like while you're comboing, to a combo piece, where if you have 3 Philosopher's Stones out, you can play it for free, bounce one of the wizards, and get not only the extra card draw, but a full set of reset discounts again. So
and if it's a Simulacrum that you bounce,
great combo piece.
You can bounce a Simulacrum. The copy of Grandmaster Wizard is just insane. When you get, if that play happens, you probably have won the game. Probably, just because if you have all of those pieces in play off the back of those draws, you're probably just potentially doing it the exact same thing again.
Yeah.
But also, it's really important just because a big part of this deck is just not dying too quickly, and. Yeah, but with the Changeling as well, obviously, it's a little bit like the Simulacrum in a way, but maybe even a bit better for the early game drop, just because you can bounce whatever their early play was, and then they've got to then cast it again. It can also block. You can also flash it back. There are certainly games where it just easily buys you an extra turn, sometimes even 2 turns, because you played it early.
Yeah, and then 3 with a flashback.
So potentially, if that's just, not all matchups, it really depends on what they're playing, because if they're spending all their mana to play the same thing over and over and over again, it's obviously massive, this play. But there are other decks that it's just, they're just like Sorcerer type decks, if they're drawing 2 and playing 2 a turn. And
yeah, it might not ever come back down.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's just, as an early play, sometimes it's absolutely huge, and other times it's a bit meh kind of thing, but...
Yeah. I mean, a big thing about it is it's more of like because you very rarely run out of cards with this deck, and it's more about a mana fight. If you play this, even if you bounce their 3-drop, but if you potentially paid less mana for it through Stone, or you had your cores out, so you got it out quicker, all of a sudden you're winning that mana fight very heavily, and then as soon as you play, you flash it back, all of a sudden you could be up like 5 or 6 mana over the course of a few turns through the Changelings, and it just buys you an incredible amount of time.
They're one of the few cards in the deck that do multiple things. They're flexible. They help you when you're going through your combo, potentially massively so, and they also help you survive to be able to start your combo. And they also just do random good things sometimes as well. Just a bit like the Simulacrum. There are just random game states where you can just do something that's just really good for some reason. You cast a Great Old One or something and they shackles it, and then you can bounce it and recast it, right? Like, there are all sorts of random things that it could just do. So I think we'll talk about, whilst we're talking about broken interactions, there's one that pops up in a lot of decks that the decks just were never that good, effectively, but the combo is good, but we never really seen, or before this deck, even ourselves managed to build a deck that utilized it properly, which is the Plague of Frogs and the Manuscript. And part of the reason why that combo is so good in this deck is because
both cards are good outside of having them together in this deck.
That's one reason. There's a few, right? So one is that the Plague of, they're both independently good. The Plague of Frogs probably more so. With the Manuscript, for example, when you start comboing, or when you want to start comboing, quite often you're just 1 card short. Quite often you can just use it and just draw 1 card by killing a wizard or whatever the case is, or a Mermaids or something, or your princess, and that can just get you going, because 1, you drew the card from killing your princess, but 2, you get to flashback the princess.
That's the line of thinking I was going down as well. And a lot of the time, it also gives you a way to potentially put your minions in the graveyard to flashback. Maybe your opponent played around the positioning, because especially with the positioning in this deck, you have to load up all of your wizards wherever your Deathspeaker is. A lot of the time they don't get to block, so you can also potentially use them for their discounts and then just kill them with the Manuscript to get another card as well on top, and then you can just keep going and flashing back as well. There's a lot of other uses for it outside of just a combo.
Yeah, and it's not something that happens regularly, but certainly something that happened once for me in the tournament, but plenty of times when we were testing, where sometimes you're just going to just use it on your avatar as well. It's not common, but if you're close to going off and you're just on 20 life and you know that you're about to go off, or you are in the process of going off, and you just need one.
Especially if you already have eggs in play, right?
Yep.
And then you can
exactly
definitely do it.
Yep. I guess it's just more like it's like there's a list of things you can do with it, and it's like right near the bottom of the list, basically. But it is a thing that you can do, so it makes the card even better. But then you've also got the big interaction with it, which is, well, two actually. I mean, it's the Plague of Frogs, and it's the Tadpole Pool.
Yep.
And then potentially the Mirror Realm Tadpole Pool as well. So you can potentially have 13 frogs. I mean, there are games where you're just on the back foot, and you just got to cast a Plague of Frogs to the surface to block. But typically speaking, you're not. You're just casting them on the subsurface somewhere that's safe, i.e. like somewhere they can't sinkhole. You're normally casting them, if you've already got the Tadpole Pool out, you're normally casting them where those other 3 frogs already are. And then that's normally where you will just cast your cores and stuff, submerged. If they're sitting there, at any point in the game, if you draw the Manuscript, you basically win the game. If you already have 7 to 10 frogs, or 7 to 13 frogs sitting together. Because if they're already there, and you draw the Manuscript, you can immediately draw those 7 to 13 cards in that same turn that you drew it.
Yeah, and if you draw that many cards, there's almost no chance you're not going to combo off and draw the rest of your deck as well.
They're good blockers. As they can, those 7 blockers can potentially buy you many turns as well in some games. But then you also have the Submerge Antics. If those 7 frogs are placed where you start, even if they can potentially pick off the frogs on the surface, you can potentially, or pick off a frog on the surface, you can potentially just put 2 on the surface, and you can still rotate your Philosopher's Stones from the surface to the subsurface with some of those frogs each turn, back and forth, to protect them. With the way that the mana base is constructed, that triple water threshold is not an issue at all. Not early, even.
No, triple water is definitely the easiest one to get with this mana base.
So there are games where potentially you're just jamming that on turn, 2 potentially even, but certainly turn 3, and it just bought you like 5 turns if you did it as well.
Yeah. And like, if you have a stone, it's free as well.
Yeah.
Which is not insignificant when you're like actually comboing off or even just trying to buy turns.
So the thing that, like you're saying, that's a big part of it. The fact that the Plague of Frogs, even if the Manuscript isn't in the deck, possibly the frogs are still in the deck anyway.
I think they're guaranteed still in the deck.
The converse is also true. Even if the frogs aren't in the deck, possibly the Manuscript is. But obviously, once you have one, you definitely have the other anyway, because they basically say, if you get both of these, you win. There
was certainly times during testing where I was like, do we cut Manuscript every now and then? But then I was always of the opinion of like, no, but we just want to play the frogs anyway for more Submerge minions. And then if you're playing the frogs, it's like, well, I guess you just have to play the Manuscript because it's such a game-winning combo if you do get it. So, and with so much extra card draw in the deck, it's not like, you do get it. It's not like most decks where you have a 2-card combo and you get to play one of each in a 40-card deck. Most games you're not going to get there, but when most of the rest of your deck also draws cards, you're probably going to get there in most games. So,
yeah, and a big part of that is browse, obviously, because it almost guarantees that you do get there, right? Because you will cast browse at some point, or you'll find the Manuscript or the browse, likely one of those 2 cards you're gonna, or your opening hand of mulligans and whatever. But the reality is, very rarely are they just going to be 2 of the very last cards you see in the deck. So one of them you will see at some point before the end of the game, nearly all the time. And if that's the Manuscript, then you have the Manuscript. And if that's the browse, then you probably either one of those next 7 cards is the Manuscript, or it isn't. In which case, you've just put 6 cards on the bottom of the deck that aren't the Manuscript. So the Manuscript is not one of the last 6 cards.
Yep.
I think it's just because you're drawing so many cards, and then with the browse in particular, it kind of guarantees that you're not going to get the Manuscript last hardly ever because of the browse. Importantly as well, it doesn't matter if you don't get it. You can just win anyway. It's just an extra way to win. It's an extra cool interaction. But the browse is really good with the Manuscript, but it's even better with the Mermaids. Like, it has other good interactions. So I think a big part of this deck, it's not like there are these combos that, these 2 cards that only do something together. Like, the Simulacrum is still good no matter what else you get. Like, the Changeling is still good no matter what else, and so on. So a big part of this deck is just making sure that the number of cards that if you draw them, and you don't have a specific game state, or you don't have a specific other card, and they just sit in your hand dead, you don't want many of those cards to exist. So far, we've basically not really talked about any. I mean, the closest card to that we've talked about so far is probably the Replicate. Where if you don't have anything to replicate, it kind of is dead. But it's such a key piece of the combo, and there are also so many... If you're willing to just copy a core...
Yeah, there's still 7 targets, so it's like... It's pretty unlikely you won't have something to replicate if you do just want to jam it.
It's a good example of one of those cards that you're very happy just to have as the bottom card of your deck. If you draw it in your opening hand and you don't have a target, if you don't have something to copy, you just put it on the bottom. Yeah. I don't know if there's anything much else to say about the frogs and the manuscript, other than just... The manuscript is still crazy good, even if you just have the Tadpole Pool. Like, it's still 2 mana to draw 3 cards. Grandmaster Wizard is considered extremely powerful because it draws 3 cards for 6 mana. So,
even if you just play it with your Tadpole Pool and then just leave it there unsubmersed and then just never get it again, it's still done more than enough work.
And then there's still a chance that it's whatever point later down the track in the game you get the Plague of Frogs and you can just cast them all submerged where the manuscript is.
Exactly.
But I think the point is that even if it only draws 3 cards from the Tadpole Pool, it's still crazy good. You don't have to draw like 15 cards with it for it to be worth it.
Even if you don't get any of like the good, like multiple, like the Tadpole Pool, the ones that generate multiple creatures, even if you just jam it on like one of your... Like your princess or something, and you kill your princess, you still get a card. It still always replaces itself. And replacing yourself for 2 mana is just good, right? Like, because, Apprentice Wizard, they replace themselves for 3. Mermaids, they replace themselves for 3. So it's already good in that scenario.
Yeah, and like we said before, you can also flash them back because of the Deathspeaker ability. So it's obviously can be crazy good. But just even ignoring that interaction where you can cast them again... It's still even disproportionately valuable in this deck because it's still a combo deck at the end of the day, right? Even if you just cycle through 1 extra card, you're getting to every other card 1 card quicker.
Potentially it's a key card, even just 1 card deeper. Even if it's just like, it's more cards in hand for Jinn to discard as well.
So let's talk about the Vile Imp, I think. Just we sort of skip that a bit. Like, maybe there's a question like, why only 2 Vile Imps? I think is, you look at the deck list and everything else almost makes sense at all the numbers, but I think people would ask why only 2 Vile Imps, because quite often there's 4 in a Deathspeaker deck. You want to answer that one?
So with this mana base in particular, it's pretty hard to consistently cast them on turn 2 as a defensive option. So then all of a sudden you're already getting up into your other defensive options of like Fey Changeling and Simulacrum and things like that. So they're not like the best defensive option in this list in particular. So we ended up just trimming them for other cards, but we still stayed at 2 because they're still a very good way to kill them on death's door with Summoning Sphere. So you can like discard 1 and still be able to flash it back. So you always needed, it felt like at least 1. And yeah, it just felt like 2 sort of felt right. I'm sure if we had more space, maybe we'd play 3. But I don't think you'd go above 3. And with this deck in particular, there's only so many cards that you can play that aren't part of the combo pieces, realistically. And that's sort of like the whole defensive package is probably a good thing to talk about here with like... So you've got the Imps, you got the Novas, you got Atlantean Fate, and the Death Dealer are like sort of your core defensive package. And yeah, so the Atlantean Fate is obviously just in there because it's like incredible. It's really good removal, and even there's games where you don't even use it as removal and you just kill all the thresholds of your opponent's things.
It also enables you to steal all their artifacts because you have submerged minions.
Yeah, you just wander over and grab them all. So
potentially you can have 4 Philosopher's Stones.
Yep. And then there's the Poison Novas, which are just feel like they're necessary to buy, because a lot of the time you're just stalling for the first few turns and not like actually straight up trading, and then you'll just have a turn where you get a Poison Nova for like potentially 4 or 5 minions, and then it just completely swings to get the tempo of the whole game into your favor. Same deal with the Death Dealer, except you can flash it back, so pretty good. Is that all the defensive cards, really?
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, there are others that arguably are like pseudo-defensive that like the Heat Ray and the Grapple Shot. Like they can potentially do something.
Yeah, they can be defensive, but they're mostly there as part of like either just a straight up finisher or combo pieces, realistically.
And there is something that I think with the package generally, which is also any deck that is some kind of control-y deck that is playing Poison Novas, generally, it does end up where we try 1, we try 2, we try 3, we try none, and we're trying like 4 Vile Imps and 2 Vile, and we're moving between all of these numbers. And there's always this balance that's different in every deck, where the more things that you have that cost less than 5 that actually kill something of theirs, the worse Poison Nova becomes.
Yes.
And the less things that you have that kill something of theirs that cost less than 5, the better it becomes. So the more chump blockers you have that are just there to just absorb some damage and die, but they don't kill anything, it makes Poison Nova better. And that's a reason why the more Vile Imps you have, the worse Poison Nova becomes as well. Absolutely. I can definitely see there are decks that you would want 4 Vile Imps and 3 Poison Novas, but broadly speaking, if you play the Vile Imp and it kills something with its Genesis, then that's one less thing the Poison Nova can possibly kill. Especially with Deathspeaker, you potentially even then flash back the Imp and you kill another thing with that, and then you cast Poison Nova to just kill one thing after when it could have killed all 3. So it's just something generally, right? It feels like every time we're building a deck that has Poison Nova in it, it feels like this little dance that we go through, back and forth, through the whole process.
Yeah, absolutely. It's different with every single deck as well.
And then obviously this one also has a couple of other things. So one, it has a Death Dealer, so it has another thing that gets extra value by stalling instead of killing their stuff. And then obviously you also get to flash it back after that, which is even more value.
You also get potentially Selfsame Simulacrum, so you can do it 3 times.
And then the other big thing with this deck is, other than the Great Old One, it really doesn't have anything much that you're ever going to play that you care if you kill as well with the poison. Absolutely. If you kill your own thing with the Poison Nova or the Death Dealer, you don't really care.
And sometimes it's the benefit as well,
which makes the board wipes even better. I think that's a big reason why only 2 Vile Imps, and they're all the reasons. They're not as good because you have the board wipes. They're not as good because you can't play them early necessarily because of the mana base. But having said that, they're still a really good card, and they're still a really good card in particular with Deathspeaker, and they're still really good as a finisher with Summoning Sphere. I don't think there was any version of this deck that didn't have one of them in there.
Yeah, it was basically, it came down to, if we go to 0, do we even play Fire, was a question that came up quite a few times during testing.
Yeah, but then you lose the Poison Novas. And
you lose the Death Dealer, and you lose the Heat Ray, which is a great finisher, which is the best finisher, realistically.
Let's talk about the Nimbus Jinn, because we're talking about the combos, drawing all the cards. How do you actually, in the end, you draw all these cards or whatever, that's all good and well, but you still haven't won the game yet. How do you actually do the 20 damage to them? Because this deck in particular, it can sometimes get chip damage, and a critical threshold because of the Nimbus Jinn is trying to get 2 chip damage in to get them down to 18. That is doable some games. So that's an important threshold to try and reach. And obviously there is Nimbus Jinn, but there's only one Nimbus Jinn and only one Summoning Sphere. So how is that reliable? And I think a big part of it is that, well, when you draw, you typically draw your whole deck, so you only need one of each, and you're going to draw them both. Now, sometimes, obviously, you don't draw the whole deck. So why did we end up with Summoning Sphere, I guess? And, I mean, because obviously, if you draw your whole deck, or you draw a whole bunch of cards, obviously, like, you can cast Summoning Sphere and drop the Nimbus Jinn, and discard a bunch of cards on them, and you can win. And you just need a finisher afterwards, and we'll talk about the ways to finish, but... So, why is there only one Nimbus Jinn, and why is it Summoning Sphere instead of what's the alternative one? The
Evil Presence.
Evil Presence.
So I suppose we'll start with why one Nimbus Jinn, and realistically, it's just because you draw so many cards, and there's the games where you potentially sputter out a bit and you don't draw cards very quickly, and if you draw Nimbus Jinn in that point of the game, it feels really bad and can really slow you down. So if there's 2, there's more chance you do that. And you never cast Nimbus Jinn in this deck outside of just killing them with it. So you'd only ever play 2 if you just wanted to get to the combo faster, and getting to this combo faster generally doesn't matter, because if you get there fast, you don't have the cards to discard, so it's already like not really a combo piece that matters. In this deck in particular, you do just, more often than not, either draw your whole deck, or if you don't quite get there, you'll have a browse that can like filter the bottom of the rest of your deck, and you do at least get your combo piece. I think the more interesting question is the Summoning Sphere versus Evil Presence. So the benefits of Evil Presence, it means you need less cards to do the combo out, because you get the attack in, you get the card to pick back up and discard. It's much easier to combo earlier.
Yeah, so it's 2 less cards, potentially 3 less cards.
Potentially, yes. But the issues with that is then it can be quite hard to finish them after, because they'll just kill the Jinn and then you need a way to finish them. Whereas Summoning Sphere, if you already have the extra cards, the Summoning Sphere is better, because then you can kill them with the imps. You can potentially just like drop multiple minions near them and kill them slowly that way. But yeah, realistically, the Summoning Sphere just gives them 2 threats they basically have to deal with when you combo. They have to kill the Jinn and the Summoning Sphere, or they die. It's just that a little bit more flexible. It also opens up lines of play where if they manage to get themselves Cloud City'd into a corner, you could like potentially just Summoning Sphere a Great Old One on their head, and then they have to deal with that. It's just more flexible at killing them, basically. It just gives you that little bit more pressure after you actually combo. The other interesting part of this discussion, though, is Grapple Shot, with the Jinn in particular. So it sort of plays like the in-between guy between Summoning Sphere and Evil Presence, because there's games where you can just play the Nimbus Jinn on your side, grapple it to where they are, and then combo. Whereas Grapple Shot, it sort of is very flexible, where if you didn't need to Grapple Shot them that way, you can quite easily kill them with something else with the grapple, because grapple is such a good finisher. But the Grapple Shot in particular doubles up in this deck as a pseudo combo piece with like Great Old Ones and Island Leviathans when you play them. So you play Great Old One, flood the whole realm, activate your Island Leviathan, punch with them for 16, and then potentially Grapple Shot one of them for Death's Door, or even the Great Old One and one Island Leviathan will get you there too. It's more about just being the more flexible options, and Evil Presence has no flexibility whatsoever, because you can only cast it with Jinn. But one other thing to mention with Evil Presence Nimbus Jinn versions, then you can fit in a Grim Reaper as like one of your defensive options, because you can play, it's pretty good with Evil Presence, but overall the Summoning Sphere grapple is just that bit more flexible with other cards in the deck.
I mean,
and a better finisher.
Yeah. I mean, it was just a big part of that. Like, there's only so many cards you can have in the deck that just don't do anything if you don't have their partner card, or you don't have the exact situation. So the Evil Presence is just, it's an incredibly narrow card, which is fine for a deck that is a one-trick pony. But this isn't a one-trick pony, this deck. You don't have to have the Nimbus Jinn do any damage at all to them. You can still win. You just win with the Great Old One or the Island of Light. Like, you have an entirely separate path to victory that doesn't involve the Jinn. The Evil Presence wouldn't help at all with that other path, whereas the Grapple Shot does. So it's just like has way more utility. The Evil Presence in particular is way better in the decks that the mana isn't the issue, the cards are the issue. Drawing the cards is the issue.
Yes.
Whereas this deck is the opposite. It's like drawing the cards is not the issue. You don't even have the card until you've drawn your whole deck. That's not the issue. The issue is more likely to be the mana than it is the cards. But neither of those are probably the issue when you have it. When you have the combo, you probably have the cards and the mana.
Yep, for sure.
At that point,
a big part of why there's only one of each.
Yeah. So the Grapple Shot is just there. Is just like, it is an extra way that you can get it on top of them. But like you're saying, it also awesome with the Great Old One, and it also does a serious lifting with the Great Old One, which we hadn't talked a lot about, but you definitely said it without explicitly explaining why. But the Great Old One floods the realm when it comes into play. It normally will activate your Island Leviathan, or Island Leviathans, and you can potentially have 3 of them because of Mirror Realm. But if you have 2 of them, potentially they're hitting for 16, and then if you have the grapple shot, they're potentially hitting for 24. So even though the Great Old One himself doesn't do any damage at all, him entering the realm potentially does all of the damage that turn, just because of the Island Leviathans. And obviously, potentially, you can just cast the Great Old One and grapple shot the Great Old One onto them for 16 damage, and then just whack them with one Island Leviathan, or have otherwise done 4 chip damage somehow. But also, it just, like we were talking about before, with the Fey Changelings and the Simulacrums and stuff, like, there are just random situations where the card just does something really useful. Like, you played a game where, in the finals, right, your opponent had a Grim Reaper that could potentially do a Rolling Boulder, which would have been crazy bad, because he would have got the kill credit for everything that the boulder hit, potentially removing all the wizards and all the mermaids and everything from the deck, which, especially if it included Grandmaster wizards, that could have been a total disaster. And you just grapple shot a wizard or whatever it was onto him, right, to kill it.
It was a death dealer.
Yeah. It's not obviously a key reason why the card is there, but I think a key reason why the card is there is that it's versatile.
It's flexible. Yeah.
And it can just randomly do stuff, and the better you are at the game, the better the card is, the more situations you can create for it. And then it's also like a pretty strong finisher when they're on death's door as well, especially because in this deck in particular, it's even stronger because, for example, Fey Changeling and Grapple Shot, they just can't do anything to stop that. Like, you just drop the Fey Changeling on their head, right, and Grapple Shot onto them. It doesn't matter what they're positioned anywhere, they're dead.
Yep. And even if they had a Royal Bodyguard, right, you just bounce it with the Changeling.
Yeah.
And then you just grapple and they're dead. There's basically no out to that.
But it's also a pretty good finisher.
When you combo and put them to death's door, you can easily keep a Fey Changeling in your hand.
Yeah.
And the grapple.
But it's not the best finisher, but it's a good finisher. It's doing many roles here, right? Like, it's potentially giving you it's getting the Jinn Combo on top of them. It's potentially giving you another big combo with the Great Old One or the Island Leviathans. It's also potentially...
It's also a good way to reposition your Island Leviathans if you had to play them in the back row to be safer from sinkholes or anything like that.
Yeah, and obviously you can also, if your Island Leviathan is on the back row, like when you activate it, you grapple shot it onto their avatar if you're lucky, right? Hit them with that, and then you'll be able to attack, because otherwise you couldn't attack at all if they're on the back row. So it's potentially helping all of those things, but it's also potentially, when they're on death's door, a finisher. And then it also just has random utility. So it's, I don't know, it was quite late on in the process where we realised how good this card was in the deck, but it's just, there's absolutely no way that this would, now once you started playing with it, that is going out and an Evil Presence or something is coming in. Like, it felt so good just because of all of the flexibility.
Just the absolute flexibility is just, it just made it good enough that it was just never coming out. I mean, maybe the question people might ask is, why isn't there more grapple shots then, if we think it's that good? And it's incredibly flexible, but you just don't need that many finishers, right? Like, there's only so many slots you can dedicate to it, and one grapple shot, one heat ray felt just correct, just better, because grapple shots, incredibly flexible throughout the game, whereas the heat ray, maybe you can play it and get a little bit of a removal, but it's very much just a finisher. And the thing with heat ray is you can get every spot on the board covered very easily as a finisher just by casting a wizard and a heat ray.
Yeah, you just got to hold wizard and heat ray. They're the only two cards you need in your hand, right? You combo, you can discard everything else, and as long as you keep a wizard and a heat ray, you probably have the entire board covered, no matter what.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a big thing as well with the one-offs, and again, the disenchant is like, why is there one disenchant? Like, how do you draw that when you need it?
So when they can stop you from being able to kill you with a Jinn, basically. What was the card we put it in there for? Because there was Atlantean Fate. Silence, yeah. Yeah, so you just needed a way to deal with silence when you were going off.
That was part of it. But it was also trying to just not instantly lose against Maddening Bells, because Avatar of Earth is still crazy broken. Like Avatar of Air is crazy good. Like Maddening Bells, and I mean the deck is generally good, generally one of the best decks. But then it also Maddening Bells is just crazy. Like, it's just, I don't know. People think that I don't know. It feels like people like it feels way better than Roots. I don't know.
I mean, even just like the interactions with this deck, like people were saying, you know, the dropping and the picking up and having infinite discounts was completely overpowered and breaking game mechanics. But they, in the same vein, they also thought that maddening bells wasn't an issue, and that's
because you can only play two of them. I mean, the card is stupid. I mean, I think the thing with maddening bells, unlike Roots and unlike anything else, right, is that maddening bells is just good against everything. It's just how, like, it's not like it's bad against something, right? It's just, it's either really, really good. There are so many decks where if they just turn 3 Maddening Bells you, and it's possible they can turn 2 Maddening Bells you, by the way, but if they turn 3 Maddening Bells you, which is very possible, especially if they're on the play, they just win. It's just game over. Absolutely game over.
Every single deck we make, we always take bells into consideration, because it's just... It's incredibly powerful. It's in basically the best deck, and it's a very popular deck now too, after all the wins that it's been getting. So it's and one of the best ways to deal with the bells is Roots. So, and when Roots isn't around, it becomes more powerful. So
yeah, and that's another reason why with the Disenchant is because if you do happen to have it early, then you have an out against it. But this deck also, like, which is a big thing for us, bells is a big thing, like you're saying, but so bells and Roots were the two big things, right? If we build a deck that just loses to either of those things, it's in the rubbish bin, pretty much, which is how this deck ended up in the rubbish bin, because it just lost to Roots, but with the Roots removed from the tournament effectively, but bells was still there. But this deck actually has other, I don't know, pseudo-answer. One is the one Disenchant.
You slight ways around bells, and
the spellcaster.
I actually managed to beat not a super early bell, like probably like a turn 4 or turn 5 bells, and then like a turn 7 or 8 bells in the top 8, and it was mostly due to it wasn't so. I had to play Atlantean Fate after I got to 7 mana, turn off like 4 of my own thresholds, completely screw myself. But I managed to kill 3 or 4 minions, get rid of the bells, and then on the second bells, I was just wide enough on the board that I could just play a wizard far enough away from it and cast from the secondary wizard that wasn't under the bells. So, but yeah, if it's not super early, there's definitely ways around it with this deck outside of the Disenchant, but it's not comfortable, put it that way.
Like we're saying, when we're building decks, you need, it's not, I don't know if outs is the word, but you can't just instantly lose because they cast the bells at some point in the game. You know, obviously getting rid of it. So Disenchant is one, but obviously burying it or submerging it is another possible way. But, you know, having a spellcaster that you can, wanting to play white on your sites and jamming a spellcasters that are far from you means that they can cast your spells, right? When the bells is on you as well.
Yeah. So
that's an answer that this deck has, that it has spellcasters, basically. I mean, sure, the Avatar of Air can pick them off or whatever, but it's not like because you've got a spellcaster it's an answer to bells. It's just like a pseudo path possible answer. The Disenchant is actually an answer, and the Philosopher's Stone is kind of like a pseudo answer, right? Because it makes everything cost 2 more, but the stone costs 1 less, right? And if you can manage to replicate it, then it's like it's zeroed out type of thing.
Yeah, if you're zeroing out, then you're not comboing, and that feels pretty bad after you've invested multiple cards. But yeah, bells is not a comfortable card to play against.
No, this isn't. I mean, hardly any decks are actually good playing into it. But I guess all I'm saying is that this deck doesn't instantly lose just because they cast bells, and there are plenty of decks that do just instantly lose.
Yeah, for sure. Because it also depends on how early they get it. Like a lot of the time, if they bells on turn 3, you're probably going to lose, and if they follow it up with a sinkhole, you definitely lose. Like there's no getting out of that. But no deck gets out of that, so it's like maybe that's not even an issue. Maybe that's more of an issue with bells.
Well, the only deck that gets out of that is a deck that then just blew up Roots the next turn.
Plays Roots, yeah.
Right, so
true.
Which is a reason why Roots is something that just naturally helps keep bells in balance a bit, because it is just a generally powerful deck, and it's something that the Avatar of Air has to be cautious of, right? Like if they see Roots on the board and they choose to overextend, then
yeah,
they
kind of
lose.
just like bells you, and then you apparently root,
and if
then
they
they're
don't
holding
overextend because they're holding stuff back in case you roots, then you bought yourself time, right? But without roots keeping it
in check,
it's just it's just the best egg or the best. I don't know. Bells is
even with losing Chaos Twister, it's still the best deck when roots isn't an option.
I mean, I think the main issue that I have with Bells in particular is just that it encourages, I don't know what I would call it, something like negative deck design, where it's like it prevents you from doing fun things and playing cool cards because it exists.
Yeah, and I mean, roots sort of feels that he's in that same card pool as well.
Sort of.
So is Chaos.
Chaos Twister definitely is. Like, Chaos Twister basically says, as far as I can tell anyway, you're not allowed to play any minion in the game that has 6 or more power unless it has a powerful Genesis effect that you're happy to instantly lose before it does anything other than the Genesis effect. As far as I know, there are no minions that are played at all in any deck that's any good where Chaos Twister is allowed that breach that statement that I just made, right? I think it's Ratana's Titan and that's it, and that's because it has Genesis and Genesis effect. And there are no other minions with 6 or more power. And the fact that their Chaos Twister makes it so that Great Old One and all of these other really cool minions that are all these fatties, if you want to call them that, whatever, right? Like, there's all these super cool fun cards, and you're not allowed to play any of them because Chaos Twister exists. So that's what I mean by negative. And Bells is the same, right? Like, you're not allowed to play a deck that can't. Whereas, for example, like against Roots, the way that you can beat Roots is just that you beat them before they can Roots, right? Like, that's one option. Another option is that you're just playing things like Cores and Stones or Bedrocks or whatever, and that you just hold some of that back. Like, you just play smart when you're playing against it, and you hold some of that stuff back in your hand, right? So they blow up the board with Roots, and then you just drop all of your Cores and everything the next turn. And another thing is, like, you don't tap draw side, tap player side, but you just tap draw, right? When you really have enough mana.
That, like, Roots is like the least offensive of these 3 cards, but I do think it's probably still, it does make people have to change the way they design their deck, right? Like,
Sure.
with what you're saying, right? Like, maybe you have to play Bedrocks in a deck that you don't really want to play them in, or you have to just play Cores that you don't even want to cast until after a Root. So there's definitely considerations to make. But the other 2 are way more of an issue in it.
Yeah, but I just see Brutes more in like the same bucket as, say, like Nimbus Jinn Combo, right? Where like you need, if that's something, if your deck isn't fast enough to beat them before they do it, and it's popular, anything that if and when it's popular in the meta, you need to have a Gnome Hollows or a Silence or something, right? Like, you need to have or a Root Spider or whatever it is, right? Like, you need to have an out, and it's I see Roots more like that, right? Like, Roots is only really meta warping when it's popular. If no one's playing it, hardly it doesn't matter, right? And that's the same as the Nimbus Jinn to some degree. But I think the difference for me is that things like Chaos Twister is just, it's so ridiculously good, so ridiculously powerful that where it's allowed in the meta, it's just everywhere. Which means that you are absolutely insane if you're playing the Great Old One in your deck and you cast it for 8 and then they just throw it in your head for 16 damage, and it costs them nothing basically. So I definitely see Chaos. Yeah, I get the point, but I see Roots more in the same conversation as
I think that's fair.
As that. Whereas, for example, I see Deathspeaker as a avatar is probably more a little bit like more joining the conversation with Chaos Twister and Bells, because
I think so too.
Because it sort of says you're not allowed to play, like, if you want to play Princess or any of these Wizards or anything, and you're not Deathspeaker, you're giving all this extra value to your opponent. It's like, you got to ask that question: are you willing to give them all that extra value? And quite often the answer is no, especially if it's popular.
I mean, that definitely came up in a lot of the other decks that we were making that weren't Deathspeaker.
Yeah, like, you're just not allowed to play these guys.
You just don't play them. Like, it just was not worth it. So.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm saying is things like Nimbus Jinn and Nimbus Jinn Combo and Roots are things that you need to be aware of when you're building your deck, and you need to be aware of when you're playing against them, right? And you need to be smart.
Yeah,
and
I think
whatever.
I think it's fair.
Whereas things like Chaos Twister and Deathspeaker as an avatar and Maddening Bells are just things that say, nope, not allowed to play that deck at all, in the rubbish bin. Do something different. Bad luck, you wanted your fun deck. No, you're not allowed to have it. It's no good because these cards exist. And there's not many cards like that, by the way. It might only be those 3 cards, just Deathspeaker the avatar, Maddening Bells, and Chaos Twister. They may be the only 3 cards where you say, you're just simply not allowed to do fun things because these cards exist. And because they exist, all of these cards are unplayable. Basically, this big list of cards just become... You're not allowed to play them. Either at all. In the case of, like, big minions, you're just not allowed to play at all because Chaos Twister exists. Or it's more just like you're not allowed to play a deck against Maddening Bells unless... If you just instantly lose if they cast it. And in the case of Deathspeaker, it's just anything with Genesis that's any good, you're just not allowed to play it. Pretty much. You got to seriously... Maybe you can, but it's like a serious question, right? Like, should you really be playing this card in the deck?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree.
Right, so bit of a tangent there, but I think we nearly got through the list. So that we didn't talk about the Atlantean Fate much.
We did a little bit.
Did a bit.
We sort of bundled it into the defensive package. I sort of mentioned,
So it's also like a pseudo, not particularly good answer to Bells as well.
Yeah, it's also a big reason why it's in there is also it turning off Gnome Hollers so that you can still combo with your Jinn.
Mm-hmm.
In particular with the Jinn combo, there's always a few cards that need to be answered to be able to do it. And, Gnome Hollers is one of them, Spider is one of them, and Atlantean Fate counters both of those. So, yes.
It's just it's just a really powerful, really flexible card. I mean, it's pretty much in any Deathspeaker deck that includes water, it's in the list, and they're probably including water specifically because they can put this card in the list.
Absolutely. I mean, we both think it's one of the best cards in the game. Like, it would probably be top 10, top 15 cards in the game if we did a list of like every single card.
Yeah, I think so too. But it's even this specific deck that we've built, it's even better than average just because it has more fringe cases where it does random things that are really good. So,
yeah, for sure.
Like,
it probably is the best water card, right?
Randomly, yeah, I think so. Probably, yeah. But randomly, it can just, in this deck, for example, it can turn on your Island Leviathans, potentially.
Yeah.
So,
sure.
It has that potential fringe case. When you submerge their artifacts, there's fringe cases, this deck can actually just go and grab them with the mermaids or the frogs or whatever.
There's also fringe cases where you turn back on your color out of space, I did actually do that in top 8. I played a Tadpole Pool next to it because it got blocked in and then just turned it back on with my Atlantean Fate. So
yeah, there's more fringe cases where it does something, but it's a bit better than average in this deck, but it's just incredibly flexible, powerful card.
Yeah.
That in particular, this deck has no issue with the thresholds either. Like, it always can meet that threshold requirement, and potentially it can even, there are games where it can definitely just cast it on turn 4 or 3, and potentially, especially if your opponent has put their first 4 sites in a box and they're all non-ordinary, even if it doesn't kill anything, potentially that's just game winning.
And then they all of a sudden they not only can they not play anything on the next turn, then they probably have to play at least like another 3 or 4 sites just to get their thresholds back, and then all of a sudden it's like turn 7 and you're online and they're finally just getting online, and it's absolutely game breaking. Some games.
There's one last spell that's worth talking about, which is just the Onyx Core, which I guess is just why do we have it?
We just want more mana. We just want as much mana as we can get, and it's just good.
Yeah. Yep. So it's to help with the mana, and also because of the submerged minions, right? The cores are better in this deck than the average deck because your opponent can't get rid of them most games.
Yeah, for sure.
If you suspect they have a way to get rid of them, you can consciously just make sure they're all cast. Maybe it makes you a little bit slower, right, because of it. But there are definitely games where it's just like, well, you have a core in your opening hand, so you cast that one directly in the hands of your avatar on the first turn. But then,
and then
and all the
mermaids
subsequent ones are
off, and
submerged.
then it carries it down the next turn, and then you just load up your mermaid with all your other stuff.
Yeah, so you have that option to cast it on the surface and then bring it down. But also, there are games where just that first core just stays on the surface for the game. It's just, but then all the rest of them end up on the subsurface.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
They can still like disenchant one of your 6 artifacts, but the other 5 are safe.
And if they're still just going 1 for 1, and they used if they disenchanted just a core, and then you play your stone and then double replicate it, they're going to be like, oh, that feels bad. Wish I had that disenchant back.
If you didn't have this, it would be more often the case that your princess is not flashing back to get anything, because there are certainly games, even with all of these, that happen sometimes, where you draw the princess late, because you're just drawing so many cards. So that's a factor. And then also just in the Deathspeaker mirror, or even not in the non-mirror, I guess Land Surveyor is the most obvious card. Like some decks play Land Surveyor, so you get to flash that back, which you care about, being able to do that.
Which is amazing. I mean, we'll get to it, but the only reason they're not in the deck is the mana base. So
we'll get to the size, but the colour out of space gives you so you have 2 Earth Thresholds potentially, and then obviously you have the Princess. So if there are Land Surveyors in their cemetery, I can see a world where you just are grabbing the Onyx Core with the Princess.
Yeah, for sure.
Especially when you're basically going to get 2 uses of the Princess, because the main thing you always want is the stone, but because you get 2 uses, you
can get both.
You get something else, and sometimes you've already drawn the stone before you get the Princess anyway, so you're getting 2 non-stones. The Onyx Core makes it when it's off-coloured for those reasons, so it's it's obvious enough why the other cores should be in there. Then the only card that we haven't, out of the spell book, that we haven't explicitly, we've referenced it a lot but not explicitly had a conversation about it, is the Highland Princess. I mean, it's sort of goes without saying to some degree. I mean, it's completely, the card generally speaking is crazy powerful. I mean, part of it obviously is that most decks that run it, but not all, but most are getting the Philosopher's Stone with it. So the reason why the Princess is so good is because it can get what is presumably the best card in the game, is Philosopher's Stone. Be an interesting conversation when we have that one day. And it's a key combo piece in this deck that it's getting. And then you're also Deathspeaker, and it's got a Genesis ability, so you get to do it twice. So it almost goes without saying, but I guess in this particular deck it has a big drawback that kind of can be a pro sometimes as well, which is that it shuffles the deck, which is generally something you don't want to do, except when you do want to do it. And it's the only shuffle effect in the whole deck, and it just, the card is just too good to not include, pretty much. Is there anything else to say on it?
No, I think you pretty much covered it all.
I mean, maybe you can talk a little bit about the fact that it does shuffle, and we are constantly talking about how you get to choose which cards go on the bottom of the deck and in what order, and you got to get that right. But sometimes, for whatever reason, you didn't get it right, and there is a card in a spot where you can't get it for whatever reason, and you need it. There are times when you do want to shuffle your deck, basically. So even though the shuffle effect is generally a bad thing because of the Mermaids and because of everything else in the deck, there are certain times where it's a good thing.
Yeah, and it's just like a bit of a necessary evil as well, like just because of how powerful the card is, and like especially how much the deck revolves around stone as well. You just have to have it. Yeah,
exactly. It's just too good to not include. But the shuffle effect is, I mean, it's just something, because there's only one card with it, it is something that you can navigate around generally. Like, for example, if you have Browse, you typically want to cast your Princess and flash it flash it back or whatever before you Browse. Or there are games, for example, that maybe you cast a Princess, but you can't kill it, and they're not going to kill it for you, probably. So you cast a Princess, then you Browse. And then when the Princess does end up dying, you can't flash it back yet, right? You got to wait till you've drawn that card off the bottom first that you need.
Yeah.
So it's just something that, like, generally speaking, it doesn't happen very often where you're just hard forced to cast the Princess when there's a card on the bottom that you want, right? Like, it can happen. And normally it involves top decking the Princess and not having the stone yet. Then you gotta wear it, basically.
Yeah, you have to do it. Yeah.
But then on the bright side, you get in the stone. So it's like
a problem.
The fact that you are ordering everything on the bottom of your deck and all of that's so important, and then just shuffles it. It makes it more interesting. Let's put it that way. Playing the deck. If nothing else, it just has that extra interesting interaction. But let's talk about the sites, I guess. We'll start with I don't know. Let's start with
Leviathan, right? Like that's
the water. Let's start with the water ones. So the Island Leviathans.
They're sort of like a big part of what the mana base was even designed around, to be honest. And they're like just that secondary win condition. They're not that hard to get online.
It's also possible to get them online without the Great Old One.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's possible. And sometimes that's a side consideration. It's we didn't talk about this much, but actually when you do the Princess to get a core, it's quite a big decision which one to get sometimes. Because, the water one can get you one threshold closer to enabling the Island Leviathan.
Mm-hmm.
And normally you have enough water thresholds for everything else, so that's the only reason to get it. Occasionally, if it's early, it will enable your Plague of Frogs or your Tadpole Pool. But then also, the Ruby Core, there isn't many fire sites, and quite often, if you want a Death Dealer early, when you've only got 4 or 5 sites out, quite often you will need to get the Ruby Core to be able to do that. And then quite often, you won't have the triple air threshold to browse. It's a decision which one to get. One of the big reasons to get the water is the Island Leviathan. Because between that and the floodplains and the fact that you do have a bunch of water sites and you have the Atlantean Fate, you kind of have the tools to potentially get to that 8 water threshold. It's possible you can get there without the Great Old One. It's an alternate win condition in and of itself. It's not like it only combos with the Great Old One. Like, it can just win without the Great Old One, basically, having to hit the table.
Yep.
It's also a Mirror Realm target.
Which there aren't many.
The positioning matters for this quite a bit, right? Because you kind of want it on the front row, so that when it enables, it can attack that at the same turn. But you also kind of don't want them to sinkhole it. But to be fair, there's also other sites of yours you kind of don't want them to sinkhole. Generally speaking, it's just played on the front row, isn't it? And if they sinkhole it, they sinkhole it.
Yeah, pretty much.
Obviously, sometimes it's just the game for whatever reason. If it's one of your first sites and you can plan around it all properly, it can end up on the front row. But sometimes you just... Especially when it's like a Deathspeaker Mirror, you have to play all of the front sites first, right? Otherwise, they infringe it. And then if you draw it later, then it's just on the back row, right? Like, there are games where it just ends up on the back row, but you want it on the front row.
There's even games where it just ends up on your starting site as well, because it's like the only water site that you had in your starting hand, and you need to be starting on a water site with this deck in particular for the
Submerge.
Well, various reasons, but mostly for the protecting stones and...
Because you just want everything jammed typically on your starting site. It is the rotating zones, but it's also the fact that there are benefits to having all of your frogs and stuff submerged in your starting location, because if you do end up on Death's Door, they can block attacks as well.
Yeah, for sure.
So there are just reasons why you want everything congregated in this deck, in particular, that you just want a lot of stuff congregated on your starting location. And because of that, you definitely want your starting location to be a water site. And it's worth just jamming this as your starting location, basically, because it's a water site. Like you're saying, it's a totally valid thing to do. That's the main time it ends up on the back row, actually, is when it's your starting site. It's might because you mulligan into it, but also there are games where you just keep it knowing it's your starting site. Another thing that can make that happen is just because your starting hand includes a Tadpole Pool as well. You definitely want to get the 3 frogs from the genesis of that.
Yeah.
I think other things just to be aware of with this is that, just as a card generally, that once it activates, it no longer provides mana anymore, but it still provides the water threshold. Not that that's probably going to matter too much for you. Maybe it does help activate a future Island Leviathan still. Talk about the floodplains next. To some degree, I don't know, are they an obvious include? I mean, you need the water thresholds. I think the main thing with this is that they can flood adjacent sites to give you the extra water thresholds, to cast the spells, to get the thresholds, to cast the Plague of Frogs, to activate the Tadpole Pool.
I think that's the main reason that it ended up being in there. Less so for the Island Leviathans. Like, it is nice, but it's like, you get a floodplain, you're guaranteed to be able to cast your Mermaids and your Simulacrums, like, on curve. And that's very important to just get things rolling.
Like, a good set of starting 3 sites is something like Floodplain, Ruins, Tadpole Pool. Something like that, because you can Floodplain your starting location and effectively...
Or even with the tower as well. So one thing it does let you do is play Floodplain and then Tower on 2 and play one of your 3 drops. Because there's the games where you don't draw a core, And then if you can't play a 3-drop on 2, you sort of feel like you're getting a long way behind, whereas the towers sort of alleviate that problem. And then if you have the Floodplain in the tower, then there's potentially, or if you didn't have the Floodplain, you wouldn't be able to cast the Deep Sea Mermaids anyway. So,
yeah,
they get you there, or they get you over the line in like a bunch of different situations and there are also Floodplains, which are just good as well. Yeah,
and they allow the if you have that, you can play the Tadpole Pool as your third side, right, and get the Genesis.
Yeah. I actually had one game come up in the top 8 that was I was carrying a submerged Devil's Egg from the Atlantean Fate with a frog, but the only way I could get it onto his side of the board was to Floodplain I managed to draw a Floodplain, play it, Floodplain one of his sites, and carry it over to the flooded site, and then just let the frog die at end of turn. But so that's another reason why Floodplain's good. Yeah. Every now and then, the submerge matters.
Well, yeah, it's probably way more fringe than Grapple Shot in regards to the random utility, but it still has random utility.
Yeah, for sure. The utility of it is getting your double thresholds early. It
can also kill.
You probably won't need it, but
it can also kill burrow things. Is a big deal.
Yeah, that's what I'm meant by Floodplain. It's Floodplain.
So yeah, it's a bunch of stuff there. I think it definitely. I don't know. We had discussions to potentially cut to 2 of them, but we always just ended up with 3 of them, right? Because of the.
Just for the mana fixing in general.
Yeah, just being able to cast that Mermaids as early, it's sort of helping making that happen is a pretty big deal. And then I think once the Simulacrums were added, that was another reason that you just... You could be in big trouble with this deck. If you don't have double water early, it can be like you just lose.
Correct.
And it really helps with that because, just having one Floodplain guarantees the double water. But there's a bunch of random other reasons why. Like, it's that early... It's helping with the double water thresholds, but early double water thresholds as well. And the fact that it can just enable the Island Leviathans. It does, like you're saying, random Floodplainy things like killing Root Spiders and other burrowed minions. And then, that Plague of Frogs play to bring the Devil's Egg back onto their side is pretty fringe, but ultimately possible because of what it does.
Yeah.
We talked about the towers a bit, so there's one of each tower.
Which does seem very standard for a Deathspeaker list, but there was times where we considered even taking one out, or just for, threshold reasons or space to get other things in, but just at the end of the day, the fact I was very, leaning toward, no, we need 3 towers just for that situation that I mentioned where it's like, if you don't have your core, you need to be able to hit your 3s on turn 2. Otherwise, you start feeling like you're a long way behind. So an early tower in this deck is actually quite good. But also a late tower in this deck is also very good with jamming a Grandmaster Wizard early. Or just even getting an extra mana on the turn that you're trying to go off. Yeah.
Well, but that can be huge, actually.
Oh, absolutely. Extra mana in this deck is always wanted.
We're including towers quite often in decks that... Well, more often the case, the mana is mostly good at a specific moment, right?
Yeah.
Because you want to power out something that costs 4 on turn 3 or whatever. They're good either... There are some decks that want to play a turn 1 tower and do something, but most decks, the towers are not as good on turn 1 or 2 as what they potentially are on turn 9, right? Whereas in this deck, the tower is still potentially awesome on turn 9. It's also potentially awesome on turn 2. Potentially it's awesome. There is weird fringe cases where it's awesome on turn 1 because you can go, it's super fringe, right? But you can go Tower, Amethyst Core, Highland Princess.
Yeah.
It's fringe, but there are, turn 2 is not fringe at all. There are plenty of turn 2 plays that you would want to do with Tower. And also plenty of turn 3 and plenty of turn 4 and 5. And, it's really good towering into a Grandmaster Wizard in particular is something you sort of actually plan for. For example, you will have the tower in hand and you will draw a site to play that as the 4th site and hold back the tower to be the 5th, or site, but the tower to be on the turn where it would take you to 6 mana, basically.
Yeah, there's also the games where you just need to play one of your sweepers that turn earlier, and tower lets you do that, like your Novas or your Fate or even your Death Dealer.
There are turns, again, where you are drawing a site, Because sometimes, for example, you've got the spells, you've got the card draw in your hand. You've got wizards and Grandmaster Wizards and whatever it is. You've got the cards, but you don't have the mana. So there are games, certainly, where you will draw a site and then play a site, tap to play. But quite often it's the case, you would rather be drawing spells with this deck, generally.
Generally,
is the general rule. In an ideal world that things will play out for you, is that you have these, 3 sites you have at the start of the game, you're playing them on the first 3 turns, and then it's just tap, draw, tap, play. So you just, you're playing a site on 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 9, etc. There are games where, come turn 9, you only have 5 sites out, right? And that would be your 6th site that you're playing on turn 9.
Yeah.
If that's a tower, and you get 1 extra mana, and that can potentially enable you to go off and combo and go on to win the game, that 1 extra mana. Towers are good, whether they're pretty much at any time from turn 2 onwards. That extra mana can be super useful. And I think just in particular, because we're talking about the cores before, in this deck, 1 extra mana is way more valuable than the average deck, just because of the discounts and because of the fact that it can 1 extra mana.
You're not running cards, so you just mana stuff the whole time.
Yeah, but just that 1 extra mana, I guess, is what I'm saying, is potentially the difference between playing a bunch of stuff and drawing 6 cards and then running out, or being able to have played a Simulacrum for 1 mana and drawn 3 cards and had a whole extra set of discounts and gone off to draw your whole deck.
Yeah, absolutely.
Potentially 1 mana is the difference between drawing 7 cards and drawing 27 cards. It can be the difference. I guess all I'm saying is that I don't think we've ever built a deck where the towers felt so good at every part of the game. Most decks, they feel like they're really good at a specific moment, and they can be good at other moments. But in this deck, they do feel good at every moment in the game. It feels like it's an uncommon situation that happens where that mana is not useful. That 1 extra mana doesn't help. The only time that kind of ever happens is just because you top deck the tower. You know what I mean? It's the only site you can play, and you're drawing spells as part of your turn, and you don't know what you're going to draw, and you just draw it into things that just didn't happen to use all the mana up, right? And it's not like you're guaranteed to always use it, but they don't feel bad, is what I'm saying, at certain parts of the game. You're playing cards to draw cards, so obviously a lot of it, we're talking about how you get triple discount on stone, but obviously even when you end up in a game with triple discount, you don't start with it, you have to build towards it. So you start with none, and then you have 1, and then 2, and then 3. Once you hit triple discounts, the 1 mana always is going to do massive things, pretty much. But before you get to that point, it's possible that you just draw some cards and that 1 mana doesn't help. But most of the time it does, I guess is what, I don't know. They feel really good, towers in this deck. There were conversations at various points to cut 1, but they were never actually cut.
No.
It just felt like... having said that, I don't think you would want to play duplicates of any tower, because they would feel super bad getting 2 of the same one in a game. I do feel like it is like you just want to play.
I also don't think you can really play duplicates unless you're basically a mono element deck. You can sort of get away with it sometimes in 2, but it's you have to have no other sites that you want to be playing really to be able to play duplicates, because they're so good when there's 1, but anytime there's a duplicate, it starts getting real awkward real fast.
I mean, this type of deck, there is an alternative card. We'll get to that when we discuss the cards that didn't make the deck. But there is a card that Tower competes with for its slot, basically. Let's put it that way. So we'll get to that after. The Tadpole Pool, it's just there. I don't know. That is never going anywhere, was it?
No.
It feels
that's
crazy good.
Part of what the deck was built around was this card. So
I mean, it's probably the best side in the deck, right? It's a bit hard to say that exactly, but
probably.
It's certainly in the conversation.
With what it does for the deck, I think so. It is, yes, but
and there's not many decks that get to say that. Most decks, if it's in there, it's just an afterthought almost. You're never mulliganing that if it's in your starting hand. You're always keeping it. You're always willing to do whatever it takes to make sure that when you play it, you're going to get the 3 frogs.
Yeah.
And I think, as far as us playing the game is concerned, that says a lot. The fact that there is a site that you're always willing to keep, and that you're willing to compromise. You may have to draw a side at the beginning of your turn when you didn't really want to, right?
Yep.
And maybe even two. There are very few cards in very few decks that ever we're willing to make that kind of sacrifice for, in regards to what we mulligan and how we play it out. And I think that says a lot to how valuable those 3 frogs are. Sorry?
I said cough roots.
It's just really, really important for this deck, and I think it just alludes back a bit before. Like, if you have those 3 frogs down there at the beginning, it means a lot of things for this deck. One, it means all of your artifacts, save the stones, can be cast submerged, and they're completely protected. They can't get rid of them. That is absolutely huge, and you didn't even have to pay 3 mana to play the Mermaid down there to do that. So it means that you have the option, if you have the Mermaid, to cast them on the surface so that they can block as well and buy you a turn. It also means that when you eventually draw the Manuscript, that you already have the 3 frogs down there to instantly draw 3 cards when you draw into the Manuscript. Which, by the way, potentially could even be in your starting hand as well. Tadpole Pool is just huge in this deck. And then I think it's just the
main reason Mirror Realm got included.
Yep. Yeah, because it's not really great. I don't even know if Tadpole Pool isn't... I mean, it's an interesting conversation, to be quite frank, but I don't even know if Mirror Realm is in the deck if Tadpole Pool isn't in the deck. Maybe it is.
Yeah, well, your only target would be Leviathan. And
Leviathan,
like, is it even worth playing?
Yeah, I think it'd probably better just to have better mana, I don't know, like
the
something.
potential of sniping an Earthlight for opposing land surveyors.
Yeah.
But, yeah, it's definitely a question, because the mana base is very tight. So... yeah, it could just be.
I mean, it's not insignificant, just that it allows you to copy whatever, like ignoring whatever the actual effects of the sites are, but just the fact that you can copy certain thresholds is pretty important, because there's so many double and triple thresholds in this deck. Yeah, so just being able to like Mirror Realm and Oasis or whatever the case may be.
I mean,
the Mirror Realm probably is in the deck, even if Tadpole Pool doesn't exist, but it's
probably is, but it's also like every game you have a Mirror Realm in your opening hand, you mulligan. Pretty much. It's pretty rare you can ever keep a Mirror Realm. And
it only helps you copy the thing that you already have that helps to get you to where you need to be, but you need to have the thing.
Yeah, for sure.
So you're better off to have more things. Because, again, with an opening hand, if your opening hand is something like Ruins, Mirror Realm, Tadpole Pool, the best possible, or even just Tadpole Pool, Mirror Realm, anything other than a Floodplain, basically. Like, you can't keep the Mirror, even though the best possible Mirror Realm target is Tadpole Pool, you can't keep the Mirror Realm because you either have 0 or 1 other water threshold, and you need 2. Do you know what I mean? Like, you can't delay that long. So even though if you have the best possible Mirror Realm target in your opening hand, you still can't keep Mirror Realm, probably. Save for even if it's Floodplain, Tadpole Pool, Mirror Realm, I don't even know if you can keep that anyways, because you have no other thresholds other than water as well.
Yeah, definitely depend on the spells in your hand, but...
yeah. But I think the point remains is that it almost feels like the only site that's mulliganed 100% of the time in this deck is the Mirror Realm.
Yeah, for sure.
It can feel pretty decent late on. I think the big thing in particular is because there's so many double and triple thresholds, the fact that you get to... that it allows you to cast the Browse or whatever it is, or the Death Dealer, or whatever it is that you need to be able to cast, is yeah. I think it definitely should be in the deck. It's just a key observation here that it's always mulliganed.
Yeah. Yeah, so, there's almost no hand you keep it in. I mean, maybe you can keep it with Color Out of Space, but even then it's... yeah.
I mean, I think it's just I guess all of the Color Out of Space. Let's talk about that quickly. So you kind of don't need the Earth Threshold, but on the same note, you're okay to have it just in case they're playing Land Surveyors, so you can flash them back. It's obviously very fringe. But even without that random utility there, it still probably makes the deck anyway. Effectively, there's just a big issue with thresholds.
So anytime you have it, you feel pretty good outside of like the awkward times when you don't have a spot play it, but
I mean,
that's pretty rare in this deck because you do play a lot less.
The only time to me that it ever feels like where that spot is an issue is when you're when you're playing against Avatar of Air and they play Cloud City, or maybe not Avatar of Air specifically, but when you're playing against Cloud City, especially if they're on the play, and especially if this Color Out of Space is in your opening hand, it can be an issue, right? Because they can position to easily turn it off. They can make it super difficult for you.
Yeah.
But outside of that, you obviously are playing sites, but you don't have the land surveys, you're not drawing a bunch of sites, you're typically wanting to draw spells on your turn.
Yeah, it's pretty rare you like fill out your whole side of the realm, like with your 10 sites, so most of the time you don't, like, you won't block yourself in just by playing your own sites, is probably what we're trying to get at.
Yeah, it requires them to do something, whether that's them using Cloud City against you or Earthquaking you or whatever it is. Like, it requires them to do something to turn it off.
Yeah. There's always times when you can turn it back on with your own Atlantean Fate as well.
Yeah.
So.
Obviously, if they manage to turn it off, it's going to be pretty bad between losing all those thresholds and the mana. We did, at various stages, have the Pristine Paradise because of the mana was so tight, but that one was easier for the opponent to turn off. That one ended up not making the deck, but the colour, generally speaking, is... well,
it's fairly safe most of the time.
Yeah. And then we're basically just playing 3 of each of the 3 dual sites that run the mana for the deck, pretty much.
Yeah,
so
pretty much.
The Fire gets all of its thresholds just from the 6, the Oasis, the Ruins, and the Colour Out of Space. They're the 7 fire thresholds. And that's kind of why the fire list ended up where it ended up, just because we didn't want to include any more fire sites because we desperately needed all the air and water thresholds for everything else in the deck.
And all the other fire sites don't really have much utility either. Like,
no, there are some...
didn't feel horrible, but the fact that it was only fire threshold was sort of what ended up pushing it out.
Yeah, and I think River of Flame, there's various bits, but it's like in the end they just weren't good enough, pretty much. And
yeah, it felt better just like having less fire cards and less fire sites, realistically.
Yeah,
and what it came down to.
And the space was at such a premium that it wasn't like we were ever like saying, "Oh man, we got 6 spots. What are we going to put in them?"
Yeah, every time we were trying to put in another site, it was like, "Well, what do we take out?" And we were always arguing, like, "Is it Lighthouse? Is it Floodplain?" Like, and we never really came down on like a solid answer to either of those. And the answer was just, let's just play less fire cards.
We'll talk about the sideboard quickly. Try and not talk ages, but I mean, the sideboard was only for the final. Obviously, it mattered for you because you were in the final. It was a conscious decision, but it wasn't, and we did some testing with it, right? But it wasn't like we spent hundreds of hours testing the sideboard. Or anything like that.
I did, in the finals, I did have a bit of a joke around with Luca, how I had 8 cards to bring in, and I just brought them all in, and then took out some cards, and some of them were the cards I sideboarded in, but it was like, the only 2 cards in the sideboard that weren't good against Avatar of Air is the Sunken Treasures, but they would have been incredible against like other decks.
We'll go through them quickly. So the smokestacks was, I guess, mostly... I mean, to be fair, we were like... Yeah, we were very conscious of Avatar of Air is the best deck. Without Roots, it's just the best deck. Roots was the only thing that was really keeping it in check. Maddening Bells is completely busted. With Sinkhole in particular, and Clouds. Yeah. Like, Avatar of Air is just overpowered generally. We were very conscious.
Most of the things that they do against you, they need specific like utility sites for. Like, it turns off all the sinkholes, Sinkhole is like probably their best card against this deck. But if you get it down on turn 2 in front of you on the play, it does hurt your sites a bit, but you can deal with it way better than they can if they can't play towers, or if they have to play their sites to the back line to play their towers. You're also super happy with that. And then, yeah, it just turns off like the sinkholes is the really big issue with it.
And then the 3 disenchant again was just basically just Maddening Bells, pretty much, and obviously they're good against if you happen to play against Enchantress.
Yeah, it sort of feels like most sideboards just fill out the rest of their disenchant allotment with they just put them all in there. They're good enough.
And the Vile Imps were just
basically for if you play against a deck that the Imps are actually good at, because Imps, when they're good, are absolutely incredible at buying time early.
Yeah, which is
but
just...
when you don't need the early protection, which is why all 4 of them weren't in there, just for space, and they're just good.
Yeah, I mean, anything where that Genesis is actually probably going to kill something, they're good. Pretty much.
Yeah, basically.
And then the Drown is a bit of a utility card, but again, really just an extra answer to Bells.
Yeah, much. It was mostly Bells. It was more like the flexible answer to Bells, where like if you bring in a bunch of disenchants and they don't have bells, then you feel super bad. Whereas you can bring in like maybe one disenchant and a drown, and then you sort of feel enough protected against it. Whereas, and if they don't have it, then the drown still does something. It's not just a dead card because all your sites are water.
The Sunken Treasures were mostly for just some kind of control, playing against any control deck.
Yeah, any slow deck, you can just jam this, and it's super easy for you to bring them up because you just cast a Mermaids there, and then they can bring them up straight away.
Especially in some kind of Deathspeaker mirror, they have other advantages over you probably, right? Because they're going to be playing Firebolt. They're going to have more ways to more easily kill stuff and recast it in the same turn.
Yes.
So generally in the Deathspeaker mirror, the other deck probably has various good plays that you don't have, and this gives you a good play that they don't have, effectively, to help balance that out a bit.
Absolutely.
I mean, having said that, I think the Deathspeaker mirror is something we did test it quite a bit, and it was generally it obviously depends on the other Deathspeaker deck a lot.
Yeah, it was mostly like who does Grandmaster Wizards the most will win quite easily. So like Sunken Treasure is like the poor man's Grandmaster Wizard.
Yep.
Well, I guess when you play it with a Mermaids, it costs 6 and draws 3 cards, so...
Yeah, but also that they probably can't interrupt it, right? They can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
Whereas being able to sort of cast Grandmaster Wizards are very... If you cast it...
And then they kill it and pass it back, then you feel pretty bad.
But you also can't cast it and kill it, because then they can cast... Like it... That's why I'm saying, like, with them having the Firebolts and extra cards to... Especially if they're playing a Geistwood as well. They have options. You can potentially interrupt them and do stuff, but... This is just a play that you have that they can't do anything about. Just draws you the cards.
Yep.
And it doesn't matter where they choose, because you just put the Mermaid there straight away. So, and especially if you play it just early as well, like, you may only even have one water site, right?
Yeah, for sure. Like, if you play this, you go water site and then you play a tower, and you play it on turn 2, and they have to choose one that's close to you anyway, which will probably be your starting site, and then your turn 3 is play a water site, play a Mermaid down there. You're like, you're ready to get started. You're trucking along. You're good.
You talk about this one a bit, Fair. I think because this is the one that's probably the least obvious in many ways. Like all the rest of them are fairly standard cards that people might include for fairly standard reasons, whereas this one was a very much more like, I don't know, Secret Squirrel's tech or something like that. Something a little bit.
Yeah. Like, it was very much a eureka moment when I was just like scrolling through the cards and I'm like, actually, this is pretty good in this deck for a sideboard. Like, we were considering even trying to make it into the main deck, but it was just, it's very slow. So you can only really play it in a matchup where you're not being pressured. And it feels like majority of the decks out there at the moment of decks that sort of try to pressure you, because Deathspeaker really fell out of the meta quite a bit because of Avatar Rare, realistically. So you'd had to sort of find a new way to play the deck. And we did, but yeah, it feels like there's just too many aggro decks out there to have it in the main deck. If you're playing in a very slow meta, like, in a Roots meta, you could probably play this in the main deck, to be honest.
Yeah, this is a space issue, obviously. I don't know what you're cutting for.
Absolutely, I completely agree. I mean, maybe there's a world where you take out the fire and you're just an air water deck and you have like treasures and a different way to get your lethal damage. Maybe you play the extra grapple shot, maybe you play a bolt. They're definitely less good options than Heat Ray, but as we said earlier, right, the Changeling grapple shot is completely uncounterable, so you have that. Maybe there's a world where that's a thing.
I just realised that Root Spider counters that, by the way. But yeah, whatever.
Not if you played a Great Old one first.
I guess, yeah.
Or an Atlantean Fate.
Yeah. And then the Poison Nova, I guess, is, it's obvious enough. It's just, there's 2 in the main deck.
Yeah,
all the reasons why they're there. There are certain matchups where a third one's just going to be really good. Let's talk a bit about just playing the deck. Again, we had alluded to it throughout, but let's just talk about generally playing the deck in the tournament itself, and just generally, we have talked about some of the reasons about, I think mostly about remembering cards that you put on the bottom and choosing which ones go on the bottom and being able to get them later. That's the main thing we talked about. But
there
are certainly other things.
Is keeping track of your mana, like what discounts you've played, how much mana you have left for the turn. Like, you'll get to around like maybe turn 5 or 6, and then you just have to get out all the dice and like really manage everything very meticulously. And like, you have to do so much thinking about like, all right, if I spend this to do this, a cantrip, and then maybe that changes things, and then I have like my discounts where I need to move things, and then I flash this back, or it starts getting very thinking intensive.
Yeah, and just very fiddly as well, because you want to have counters to mark everything, but even that's not, it sounds like, okay, whatever, right? You put a counter, you mark it. Well, sort of. It's not that simple, because one, you have potentially many different spellcasters that you have to separately manage which ones have which discounts. They can only drop and pick up the artifacts once each turn. So once they've done any discounts and dropped the artifacts, at that point you
just treat them as spent and move them out of the way.
So that's okay, but it's a lot to keep track of. Let's just put it like...
So there was at the start of the day, we had a conversation with Jesse in like round 1 where it's like, how do we represent what's even on our starting site? Because there'd be like 15 things on there, and it's like, well, we can't just put them all in that one little box. And it was sort of like, just the play area in front of you can be counted as your starting area, that space where your Deathspeaker is. So you also have surface and subsurface as well. Yeah,
exactly. So there's surface and subsurface, and also things can be tapped on the surface and subsurface and untapped. It's not just a case of putting a stack of things that's on the surface and stack on the subsurface. You have to separately manage everything that's tapped. Also, as you're going through on your turn, a whole bunch of stuff will be played. So you also have to separately make sure you remember what has summoning sickness and what doesn't. You have to remember which spellcasters have had the discounts and which haven't. And those that are in the process of having discounts, which discounts they've used. You obviously also have to keep track of your mana and your thresholds. But you also have to keep track of who is carrying which artifacts and where. And it isn't a stretch to say that could be... You could have 6 artifacts, you could have 10 minions, and you could have 10 frogs, 10 tokens, and your avatar, all on your starting site. Some of them with summoning sickness, some not, some submerged, some not, some tapped, some not, and various ones carrying various different artifacts. That's totally possible that can happen in a game.
Yeah, and pretty consistently happens when you're going off.
Yep. It's important that obviously you keep track of it all, but it's just as important that your opponent knows what's going on, right? You don't want them to be confused. You want them to be clearly like know what's going on. So it's like super important to make sure that all of that's totally clear. And that's why we sort of have this big area where we treat it as the home site, where if it's, if it's on this half, it's submerged. If it's on this half, it's on the surface. As things have used their discounts, we have all these different counters that you're putting on them to show all the discounts they've used and everything. Like, effectively, everything's just got to be clearly marked as it all plays out. It's
simultaneously an incredibly fun deck to play and an incredibly annoying deck to play at the same time.
And this will be true for all decks, by the way, but I feel like from other decks, it can be a little bit more gut-feely than this one. But the mulligan at the start of the game matters a lot. And it isn't procedural, right? It's quite... I think in this deck in particular, there are so many one-offs. There's so many one-offs in this deck. It's almost like every starting hand is like the first time you ever saw that starting hand, just about. It also matters a lot what matchup you're playing against. Realistically, how much time you're going to have here, and what is... There's just more to it.
When you were saying there's so many one-offs, I was like, it doesn't feel like there's that many. And then I counted it up, and it's 17 one-offs in a 40-card deck.
Yeah.
And then there's like a bunch
and most of the rest of them are 2-ofs, right?
Yeah.
So there's only 2 cards that are 4-ofs and one that's a 3-of, and everything else is 2-of or 1-off in the deck, right? Yeah. So there's just so much variation in starting hands, so it's important to decide what to mulligan, but then you've also got the whole entire Mermaid thing to draw the cards from the bottom, which really complicates that even more, because there could be a card, for example, that you know it's important, you know that you need it, but you don't need it yet.
In like 5 or 6 turns,
yeah.
So you'd rather have any other card now.
and you put that on the bottom.
And a lot of the time, you have to mulligan like that because you need to try and find your cores early or your stone early.
Yeah, you want to mulligan as many cards as possible generally. You want to draw those. But then you've also got all your thresholds that are important. And with the new mulligan rule, it's all a factor. I guess I'm trying to explain why in words. But the mulligans for this deck felt... Most other decks, it feels... These are the cards. This is what you mulligan. That's it. No discussion almost, right?
Yeah, well, with a lot of the other decks, we got like the mulligans down to just like
a science.
Absolutely fine-tuned just through purely like math, like running the actual numbers on it. Whereas this one, it's more like, I need certain situational things, and
it's so murky. Different. Like, I guess what it's saying somewhat here is that I don't think it's way harder to pin it down to like a mathematical procedural thing that if this is your starting hand, this is what you mulligan. Like it's not. You really have to.
Is different.
Yeah,
you sort of have like you definitely have like the cards you sort of trying to get with a mulligan, but it's not so much that you always want to get rid of certain cards. Like there's obviously certain cards that you don't want in your opening hand, like your Great Old One or your Jinn, your Summoning Sphere, things like that, or your Heat Ray. But there's also the times where you want to get your cores, but outside of that, everything else is like super flexible.
Being able to cast a Grandmaster Wizard at some point is super important. Super, super important. And that's a card that sometimes you will just hold that. That's one of those cards that you love to just put on the bottom of your deck, by the way, to pull back when you need it.
Yeah, definitely done that quite a few times.
Because one of the big ways this deck does just lose, really, realistically, I think is one of the main ways, is that you just never drew a Grandmaster Wizard. You just lost. And because you never drew it, you never got to cast it, you never got to recast it, you never got to copy it with Simulacrum, you never got to bounce it with Changeling, and you never got to draw those 3 cards, which just made you find all of the other stuff, right?
As soon as you draw it, the 3 cards can quickly snowball into 12 cards, is the thing.
It's normally the moment where the whole engine just comes online, is when you cast that first Grandmaster Wizard. It's very dynamic, because it isn't just like these are the cards you want, these are the cards you don't want. It's also just like you just want a hand that just works well together as well. Just gives you those early plays and gives you something to do. But it's like it sounds good like if you just have a mermaid or a wizard, let's say a wizard, if you can cast a wizard, that's good, you can draw a card, but actually if you just mulligan the wizard, you draw a card as well.
Got that card. Yeah, I almost always mulligan like wizards and mermaids and things like that, depending on basically the only time you don't really mulligan those is like mulligan rule, where you want to mulligan the other cards more, so you don't mind keeping one of those. But yeah, they're certainly an interesting card. They're never it's never always mulligan. There's almost no cards that's the case for.
I guess there is an element in this deck. It's something like there's a moment. There are games where it's in the balance. They're doing stuff to kill you, right? And you're just dying and you're putting chump blockers in. So you're trying to buy time, but they're chipping you down. And there's always that moment where it's like, if they have the right cards, they can Death Storm me next turn. If they have a Gigantism, or they can just wipe these couple blockers or whatever. Like, there seems to be this moment where it's like, sometimes you can choose to sort of go for it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
You have a turn that's like the safe play, if you know what I mean. And you have the turn that's the risky play, but maybe if you draw the right cards, you can win. But there's a safer play that sets you up better for next turn to potentially draw out your whole deck. And it gives you something that maybe helps you buy a bit of time, because it gives you a chump blocker, or maybe you kill something, or maybe you cast an Angel's Egg or something. And there's this moment where a lot of games feel like there's this moment where it's like there's a choice. There's this choice between being conservative or being risk-taking. Something like that. So an example of this really is like, are you just casting the Grandmaster Wizard to try and just combo? You know what I mean? To just draw the cards and go on and do things. Yeah. Or do you just cast the Poison Nova or something, right? Board wipe.
Yep.
So it feels like that's something that happens. And then also, even when you start to combo, like, you have things you can do. This is the optimal word here. Things. There are things you can do, not thing. Many different things. whether that's casting a Grandmaster Wizard or whether that's flashing back something from your cemetery, whether that's casting a Mermaid to get some specific card off the bottom of your deck, whether that's playing a Sight, whatever the case is, when you're doing whatever this turn is to draw a whole bunch of stuff and potentially win the game, there are many different options you have as the start point of the turn. If we have the Manuscript and the Frogs, for example, that's typically the start point, because it costs no mana and you just want to see all the cards that you get. So typically, I think the general rule here is that we're looking to do things that give new information that have the least cost or no cost.
Yeah, I think it's a way to put it.
And the Manuscript is effectively just free draws. It, like, obviously you're losing the Frogs, but so normally what we do draw them one at a time. For the sakes of timekeeping a bit, when we know we want to draw a bunch, normally we will just draw, like we'll leave one alive and kill the rest, and then make a decision. Because the last one's important, because maybe you want to move the Manuscript somewhere. Maybe it's holding other artifacts and stuff as well. So that normally we will just draw from all the Frogs, draw those cards up, and then make the decision.
Yeah, sort of the one stop card is generally Princess. So it's like maybe you want to cast that part way through so that you can get the artifact out of your deck, or maybe you want to shuffle the bottom because reasons.
Yeah, exactly. That's a big point to make. It's a stop card. So, yeah, when you're drawing the cards or whatever, whenever you see that, your turn just stops immediately and you have to reevaluate everything. Wherever you are in the process, you've got your whole turn mapped out, but if the Princess is drawn, you have to replan the turn from wherever you got up to. Just rethink it all. Because it can get the stone or a core or whatever, because it can thin the deck of those things so you can draw other things, and because it shuffles the deck, doing big things that can potentially win or lose you the game, depending on what you choose there. If you're on Death's Door, you get a free flashback, which can be a pretty big deal, especially when it's a Grandmaster Wizard. But also, you obviously, generally speaking, do want to cast the Grandmaster Wizards, but as a general rule, and that would be normally the case, but when you have discounts, the cheaper the card, the more impactful the discount, something like that. Like when you have a triple discount, the Mermaids and the Apprentice Wizard are free, but the Grandmaster Wizard still costs 3 mana.
Yeah.
So actually,
there's definitely certain turns where maybe you had, the triple replication but you only had like 6 sites or something. So Grandmaster Wizard eating half your mana can sometimes not be as good as just playing like 3 Apprentice Wizards, off of a chain. And then you have like 1 million mana at that point, and then it's not as bad to play the Grandmaster Wizard, but you needed all that other information from the previous cantrips.
And there is a moment when you're in the process of going through everything. Am I spending the rest of this turn just drawing as many cards as possible, knowing that I can't Death Door them this turn? Or am I still hoping to Death Door them this turn? Because you need to save a certain amount of mana, right, and draw all the cards through whatever means it is, but still having that mana held in reserve to be able to do whatever it is that you're going to do to Death Door them.
Do the actual combo, absolutely. That choice normally gets hit when it's, okay, do I have to play Wizard here to keep going, knowing that now I'm not going to combo at all. I'm just going to I'm going to play a Wizard, I'm going to try and play as many Wizards as possible, and then just combo next turn. But there's certainly games where you just have to not go down that line and go, I have to try and draw the combo this turn, because if I don't Death Door them this turn, they'll Death Door me, and then on their following turn, they'll kill me with, Heat Ray or whatever. Whereas, you need to do the Death Door that one turn earlier so you can Heat Ray them.
Yeah, and they're quite often, it's the decision in the balance. If you're mid-combo, quite often casting a Grandmaster Wizard means that you will not Death Door them this turn, but you will Death Door them next turn. That's normally what it means. Whereas if you don't cast a Grandmaster Wizard and you make some other plays, that might mean that you Death Door them this turn, but it might also mean that you don't Death Door them this turn or next turn. Potentially, drawing those 3 cards off the Grandmaster Wizard, and then next turn having those 3 cards combined with all of your mana and discounts being back, will mean that you will win. But if you never actually cast the Grandmaster Wizard,
then you just don't get that.
And that's your only play next turn, and it's going to burn your mana, and you can't combo no matter what you draw. There are big decisions to make in this deck, like when to go for it and how to go for it, and when you're mid-combo, are you just resigning the fact that you won't kill them this turn, but you're going to put yourself in a position to Death Door them next turn and take the risk, right? What is that risk? And being able to evaluate that game state And obviously it evolves a bit, because as you're going through your combo, you're also probably dropping a whole bunch of minions. Are you dropping them all in your starting location to get extra discounts? Or are you going to drop them in other places so that they can block? So potentially you can last another turn. And if you drop them in the wrong spot as you're going through your combo, and then you fizzle out and you don't actually Death-Store them, potentially you just lost the game because you just put everything in the wrong spot. In a bit of a roundabout way here, unfortunately, I think the answer to what is the order that you're supposed to play everything, the answer to that is it depends, and it's different.
Yeah.
It's quite often it's a different order. And I know when we were testing this deck, every time we got to that point where potentially you can go off, and as you're going off, we're talking through trying to do the right decisions, and that one turn could be a 2-hour conversation.
Yeah, there was often days where we would test, in quotation marks, for like 6 hours, and we'd get through maybe 2.5, 3 games or whatever, because the way we test is like everything's face up, and we really discuss like every point, every turn. Was it right to draw a sight? There was some days where we'd spend a 20-30 minute conversation just about whether it was right to draw a sight or a spell for a turn, and we wouldn't come to a conclusion, and we would sort of still be split on it. And it's like, oh, this deck, it's got not an easy one. And a lot of those times, so we'd play out, both scenarios, and both variations can be right depending on what you draw throughout the rest of the game. So it's really hard to tell. And that choice is often a win or lose point as well. If you choose the wrong one, which seemed right at the time, you can potentially lose from it.
And a big part of that, really, in regards to the decision making, right, is just an understanding of this is how many cards are left in the deck, and this is what those cards are, and these are the ones that are on the bottom.
And how much time I have left in the game.
Yeah. And all of that information, you just have to manage it all in the decision. I think it's part of the reason why it's just so intensive playing this deck. It's like, it's by far the hardest deck. By far, far, far the hardest deck to play that we've ever built. Or that we've ever seen. Or that we've ever played, whether we build it or not. It's just, it feels like it's so much effort to win with this deck. It's so much, like, it feels like there are no easy wins. Like, it just...
I was completely drained by the finals.
And I can totally see why a lot of people would think that this deck is just trash, because if you're not willing to invest all the time and effort to, like, learn and memorize everything, and if you're not doing all of these things that we're talking about, it's a pretty trash deck. If you're not actually utilizing all of these different things that we're talking about, like putting cards on the bottom, remembering them, using brows like this, using the mermaids like this, having things submerged, and planning all of your turns in advance, and planning out as you combo. If you're not doing any of this stuff, it's not a very good deck.
Yeah, you can't just play it out like any other deck. It's very much like a combo deck at its core. So, yeah, there's definitely other versions you could play that's just like, you play Earth and you play Control, and you just play a slow game. You play like a fair Deathspeaker game. And then, there's just no combo. But
it's also way harder than... there isn't that many combo decks in Sorcery, I think, for starters. But if I compare it to Magic the Gathering, most combo decks, like, there's a combo that you're going for. And it's not that hard necessarily to play the deck. Like, there is just a way that you play to try to get to the combo. Whereas I think the difference with this deck is it's a combo deck, but it's not a combo in the deck. It's a whole bunch of different combos that are doing different things with different interactions.
And they all sort of synergize with each other too.
So I think it's the fact that it isn't a specific thing that you're trying to do, and that you're potentially trying to do many different things. And it's not even within the same game. There are games where, for example, there is no Philosopher's Stone. There is no discounts or double discounts. There is no passing these things around. Like, there is no drawing your whole deck in a turn. There's just you having 3 Angel's Eggs and winning.
Yeah.
Because they can't kill you.
Or just like having some cores and getting out a great old one early and turning on your Leviathans and
they just can't kill it. It's possible.
Or even just playing out like a regular Deathspeaker sort of game where you just draw like 2 to 3 Changelings, and then all of a sudden, the game's taking like, an extra 7 turns, and all of a sudden you're back into like a weird board state, and you can potentially win from there. But every game plays out so differently.
That's generally true of Sorcery, I think, which is part of the reason why I love the game. But I think with the combo deck, normally there is a way that you win. Do you know what I mean? You win with the combo. Yeah. Whereas in this deck, it feels like you're winning in a totally different way every time you win. And literally, that extends to potentially how you got them to Death-Store. There are multiple different ways you can do that. And then there's also multiple different ways you can finish them when they're on Death-Store. But then also the process to get to the point where you can do the 20 damage is a very different journey, quite often from game to game to game. I think just because of Angel's Egg is the Replicate is a big part of that, but so are all the one-offs. Having 3 or 4 Angel's Eggs versus having 0 Angel's Eggs is a totally different game, as is whoever you're playing against. If they're just going to do 20 damage in one turn, it doesn't matter how many eggs you got, right? If they're doing chip damage, there are decks that just, you could basically have nothing in the deck, never play or draw a card the rest of the game. Maybe that's a bit of a stretch, but you could do very little the rest of the game, and they just cannot overcome 4 Angel's Eggs. They just can't overcome 8 life a turn. They just simply can't do that much damage. All you have to do is basically cast 1 Poison Nova or 1 Death Dealer once every 5 turns, right? And they just simply cannot win.
Yep.
I think it's just the fact that it's... I don't know. It's just... There's so much happening. There's all of these little combos throughout the deck. All of these interactions, and it's...
I think it's a really strong deck, and it's a really cool deck, but it's also a deck that I would not want to play. Like, it's in a tournament setting. Like, it's just, by the end of the day, you're so drained, and there's a lot of other decks that are also very strong. And I think in any format where Roots is available, I would much rather play that. But yeah, it's still so. Definitely...
It was still cool to make it, and it's still cool to have these cards in... I think there is something here, especially... Like, I would be surprised, for example, if there is no other Deathspeaker deck in the future that's going to be good, that's going to utilize the Browse Mermaids thing, or utilize Simulacrum. I think some of these things will... I think there are some things in this deck that will go on to become... Or Replication with Philosopher's Stone. I think... Or Replication with Angel's Egg. Or, I don't know, or a deck that uses Plague of Frogs and Manuscript in a way that the Manuscript is good even if it doesn't have the Frogs, and the Frogs is good even if it doesn't have the Manuscript.
I think one thing just to touch on that I'm glad about, like, building this deck, like you said, like, so many people are always just saying, oh, there's nothing you can, there's no new cards, there's nothing, the meta's completely solved, like, there's no new decks that can come out. And we've played in 2 different, like, bigger tournaments, and both times we've brought out a completely new deck that was not on the radar at all. And I'm sure, and we had, like, more that could have been played if it wasn't for the fact that the Mulligan rule changed. And the other deck that we had was, very new and not known about, that we can't play for this tournament, and that we might bring out in the future. Who knows? But yeah, like, the card pool isn't solved, like, at all. So,
and I'm sure we could.
We just prove it each time we play and bring out a new deck.
I mean, it takes a lot of effort to come up with a tier 1 deck that is completely new. But
we put in, like, hundreds of hours into all of our decks. Like, this one was, a lot, but we only had a week. But the other one that we spent, like, a solid month on, and even before that, we had a few weeks where we were trying a bunch of different things until we got to that deck that we were like, all right, this is the one we're going to, like, really refine. And all the other ones were, like, pretty decent, but, with a bit more, with, like, a few weeks worth of work, would have been absolutely tier 1 decks. It's definitely doable, but you just have to be willing to put in the effort. I also think there's a bunch of different variations of this deck that could be good as well. I also do think if I wasn't so mentally drained, I probably would have been able to win that game. Like, if that finals was played at the start of the day, I think I would have won that game 3, because I played terribly in that game 3. And it's on camera, and I didn't even need to watch it on camera to go back through, like, the next day once I'd had a bit of rest, and even just think about it in my mind. I was just like, no, this was wrong, this was clearly wrong. So, yeah, there's definitely a world where I still win that.
The deck was good enough to possibly win.
Sure. I think so.
I played the same deck. I mean, we did have, the first time we played, we didn't have the luxury of really being able to play the same deck, because, as in for the ANZ Championships, where you ended up playing the Geomancer deck and winning it, because I basically only had one play set of cards. But this time, now you've got your own cards, we could just play exactly the same deck list. Yeah,
especially since, like, this is not an easy deck to build, right? Like, it's got all the store, it's got all the cores, it's got the stone, it's got a bunch of different uniques. Like, yeah, it's much harder to build on one collection, that's for sure.
Also, the other deck that we built, effectively we did make it. I don't know if it was set in stone as such, but pretty much from the start of planning for this tournament, we were like, maybe we do end up playing different decks, but let's go on with the attitude that we probably will play the same deck, because then we can focus all of our efforts onto building one good deck instead of having to build two good decks. And that option kind of wasn't available to us last time, just because we didn't have the cards. But
yeah, we also, last time we played, like, we were both still learning the game when we were building it as well, so like, even as through that, like, you know, we're learning our different play styles that we both enjoyed. So, you know, I mean, even if we could have played the same deck last time, I don't even know if we would have, to be honest. Whereas this one, it was very much like, we've had like a lot more time to talk about the game. We've learned a lot more. We have like, you know, we both like combo decks. We both, you know, really focused in on one specific thing. And yeah, it was.
I mean, I really love this deck. Despite all of the things we're saying, and like, I agree, it's so.
I do too.
I was exhausted. It was so intensive, and I mean, I missed out on top 8 on tiebreakers, and you know, I had to play you in round 2. It's like in the mirror match. I mean, holy jeez! Like
we both had a game where
I was basically just ready to finish
around us, watching us, and we both drew our whole decks. And
I mean, I was ready to go home after the second round. I mean,
I was like, it was definitely a round that we should have just gone, oh, you win.
Yeah, I mean, just
to save on memory.
I mean, I feel like we should have just drawn or whatever. I don't know. I mean, my way of feeling about that is like, I mean, I was lucky or whatever. I won against you, but I do feel like ultimately beating you was why I didn't make top 8. Like, I feel like if we had just drawn and I didn't play it, I probably stood a better chance to make top 8, because I would have just not been as mentally drained for the remaining rounds. Like, I was totally done after the second round, like pretty much. Sure. You know, I missed out on tiebreakers on the top 8, and I played you and Luca, who won it, right? I think I must have been the only person who actually played the 2 finalists. But yeah, I don't know. It's just, again, because it was only 5 rounds as well, which felt a bit. It didn't feel particularly epic at all, that tournament, especially versus the ANZ Championship, which was over 2 days, and it was 9 rounds and had a draft and
had a top 8
that was all best of 3. Like, that felt really epic and really cool. And this time it felt, well, I don't know. It felt like it was done and dusted pretty quick, and I don't know. It didn't feel as epic. Let's put it that way, because obviously it wasn't, right? It was literally It was less than half the elapsed time, right?
Yeah.
So
1 day versus 2, and it was
a quicker day. Yeah.
Yeah. I can't remember what time it finished, but it didn't feel very late.
6, before 6, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
The last time it didn't finish till pretty late, till like 8 or 8:30 or something. But anyway,
that was after a whole second day, so.
Yeah, I mean, because it was like five rounds versus 9 rounds, but also
I felt less drained after the last tournament that I played 12 rounds, and the top 8 I played, you know, like 6 games in the top 8, and it was over 2 days, and I didn't sleep almost at all for those like 3 days leading up to it, including those 2 days. I felt less drained then than playing 1 day with this deck. It's so much more mentally draining.
But it's still a super cool deck. I still would, in the end, it's just... I feel like if I had just lobbed up and just copied some other... You know, didn't build our deck and just copied somebody else's deck, even if it did better, and I still would be thinking, oh man, I wish we had played this cool deck instead. Pretty much.
I don't think I'd want to play it in a tournament again, just for that draining reason. But, you know, if there was another tournament where Roots was banned and Chaos Twist banned and all that sort of stuff, yeah, sure, I'd probably play this again, just because it might be the best deck in those
specific rule
scenarios.
Set. Yeah, maybe.
I mean, it's obviously competing with Avatar of Air, and that deck is ludicrous, but...
Yeah, it's even ludicrous when Chaos Twister is banned. It's even more ludicrous if it's not banned. But because obviously, what is it, your semi-final and final that were live streamed, so people can watch that. So maybe we'll just talk about those a little bit, because everything else is a bit like, it's less interesting because somebody can't just go and watch it. I think with the semi-final in particular, it was like that was like a pretty cool game generally, right? Like there was Pathfinder, and Pathfinder actually got quite a big indirect buff with the Mulligan rule, because Pathfinder's main issue was that it was more inconsistent than everything else, and now everything else has become more inconsistent, and Pathfinder basically wasn't hit at all with the Mulligan rule. So Pathfinder obviously still is more inconsistent than everything else, but it's just.
But now everything else is also more.
Yeah, but the gap is smaller, right? Which basically means that its inconsistency gap is not as big, but it still has its massive raw power upside of being able to just play a side every single turn, right, and still draw a spell, which is huge. So Pathfinder basically went from being something that was a bit, well, not that good, let's say.
I'm definitely looking forward to playing Pathfinder when the new set comes out.
But I think it's just good, right? With the Mulligan rule change, has made it better, just straight up better, and propelled it into clearly a tier that it went 5-0 in the Swiss rounds, right? Swiss. Like clearly it wasn't like luck that it was good or something, right? Like clearly it was a strong deck that you played in the semi-final. Yeah. And it was a game that kind of went down to the wire. It was pretty cool to watch. I mean, he basically just has you on death's door and common senses, but has no card in his whole deck that can actually finish you.
But he that was basically through my play on the turn before, because I did a pretty big combo turn but I had to move to get out of Violent range, and I had to have a disenchant to get rid of the Jihad for another Violent sort of setup, and then I had to play 3 power worth of Mermaids to my right, so that he could common sense for a Firebolts.
But that's absolutely worth watching, because that's just part of it. Because if you're not a really good player, then you lose.
Yes.
Because if you don't do all of those things, you lose.
Yeah, there was also a turn before he actually got me to Death's Door where I could have played a site to block off his Pathfinder ability on the next turn, but I chose not to, so that he couldn't attack my site with his Pathfinder for that potential, just that extra little bit of chip damage to get me to Death's Door, which he would have had if I played it on that turn. I was also playing around potential Gigantism from hand to burst me out. So that was a very intentional choice to not block him just so that he couldn't attack.
Having said that, if he has Heat Ray, he wins, which is something that we realised during building this deck. If you have Heat Ray and they're on Death's Door, you just win. And
So basically, I tried to play around every card that I could, and Heat Ray is not a card that I could have played around. So it was just play around everything that I can, which I did, and it was lucky that I did, because he did top deck the way to kill me if I didn't play that exact way. So
I definitely just think Heat Ray is just underrated a bit. I mean, it's not like it's off the radar and everybody thinks it's bad or something, but it's just underrated.
The biggest problem with Heat Ray is it's pretty bad during the game. I mean, not terrible, but definitely not good. But it is easily the best finisher, and I think
if you're playing full common sense, surely you just have one Heat Ray. That's the thing.
Yeah, I think so too. But I do think the game has been evolving more and more to where pretty much every deck always has ways to kill you on Death's Door now. It's become much more of a thing that you just need to include it, because a lot of decks, they, as soon as you're on Death's Door, they're just I don't need to block your stuff. With especially Death Dealer, you're getting free flashbacks, all that sort of stuff. So more and more people are playing ways to just straight up kill you, and I think Heat Ray is just one of those cards that needs to be included in that conversation. Grapple Shot is another one of those cards for Avatar of Air. That's just you just win when you have it when they're on Death's Door. Things like that, because it's so easy to get on top of them and then play it, and it's not a card that can be played around realistically.
Yep.
So
you need multiple ways, pretty much.
Yeah.
You need to be able to do it when you need to be able to do it. You need to make sure there's enough ways and enough cards and the way that the deck plays out that when you do get them to Death's Door, that you can just finish them the next turn. Because if you can't, then you may just lose. Right? And in certain matchups, like against Deathspeaker, it can be actively bad to put them to Death's Door if you can't finish them the next turn, because of they get the free They don't have to pay to cast the spell from the cemeteries. So I mean, that was pretty interesting. It was a pretty fun to watch as well, that one. I think that just the end, I mean, you watched the whole thing obviously, but I think the end in particular, the way it's pretty clear as I'm watching you play your turn out, I can see exactly you're doing all the things you described, but I'm like, yeah, that's what, yeah, do you know what I mean? As you're playing out the turn, I'm just thinking, yes, you,
yeah,
like that's right. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
but it also is the type of thing where, like, it wasn't something that you can't just say, oh man, I need 3 blockers to block the Firebolts. It's something you had, like, before you do anything, I need to make sure I draw enough cards that I'm going to get the 3 blockers, and they need to be here, and ideally they're the Mermaids and not the Wizards, because then I won't be able to get the discounts. And do you know what I mean? Like, it's like quite clearly all thought out. But also, you know, he still could have just top decked the desert and won anyway, right? There was 1 desert left in the deck, I think, and there was like 10 sites or 11 or something. It was like a 10% chance, something like that. But yeah, you would like to think that if you have a deck like that and you have common sense, that there should be a card that you should be able to get the wins of the game, right? And if there isn't, you probably want to just be looking at your deck list thinking maybe there should be something.
I think in most scenarios that common sense does kill me, right? Because he has Firebolts, he has Cavalry, he has Vile Imps, he has... Yeah, I think that was about it. But yeah, so obviously the 1 Hate Ray would have just done it, and I can see... I mean, he even set up the tournament like, Hate Ray's mandatory. I'm always going to play it now, but...
That was a fun one to watch anyway. It was all in the balance, right? In a really obvious way.
It was very close. I mean, and so basically it was, he'd put me to Death's Door, then I put him to Death's Door because he went onto one of my sites and I just Jinn Comboed him, and then it was like, I just had to play around him having the lethal, and I managed to do it, and then that was it, right? But yeah, it was definitely a very close game.
And then in the final, that's the other one, all 3 matches are there. That was against Luca. I think, obviously, congratulations to Luca as well. He played really well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Not just this time. He played really well last time as well. And I don't know how old he is, but he's quite young, I believe.
Yeah, in the last, like, a Australian New Zealand Championship things, he went 6-0 on day 1. So, you know, you got to play pretty well to do that. So.
Yeah, personally, we get along well with him and Nigel, his father. Like, we
our whole top 8 match, like, you can't see it on camera, but that's why like our match probably looked a lot slower than it was, because we were just bantering back and forth the whole time, just like chatting and laughing and having a real good time with the actual whole final. So
I think you won the first one, and that.
Yeah, I think I had stone double replication like within the first two or 3 turns, so that game was like pretty one-sided, just waiting for me to draw some card draw pretty much. But it was still a pretty fun and interesting game. I think that was the Death Dealer grapple game,
because that was one where we knew that interaction already with the Grim Reaper, but I think Luca asked Jesse about it, and everybody who was watching it was like asking the question, right? But I know that's one that we previously already looked at.
As soon as he got up to go ask the question, I'm like, I know what he's asking.
I've got to grapple shot him. I've got to grapple shot that Grim Reaper now. Now I know that he's got the...
I mean, I was always going to do it as well, anyway, because it was like, it was putting good pressure on, like, with the Death Dealer to actually, like, get in some good damage and actually get a kill before I could draw some cards. But yeah, it was definitely worthwhile.
I mean, there was one game, I can't remember which one, whether it was the second or the third one, but it was like, you board wiped him, and I was you probably, like, I was feeling like, man, that's got to be good, like, probably win from here. But then, because I can't see what cards anybody had, but it feels like you mustn't have just not drawn the right cards, basically, which...
Yeah, I even followed up that Nova with a Wizard, and it was just like, I wouldn't say it was garbage, but it wasn't great. The big issue with that game 3 was I just didn't have, like, I had no stone, I had no cores. It was just like I was super slow, and I made like 2 or 3 errors over like basically 2 turns to pretty much cost myself the game. But the game 2, he just completely rolled over me. The game 3, he had like double sinkhole in his first, I think it was 4 sites, and they were both off the top. Look, see, it might have been his first 5 sites, and they were both off the top to just like completely cripple me and like slow me down, and that was pretty much just game from there. But yeah, Sinkhole is like a big issue for this deck.
Yeah, I mean, it is for a lot of decks, to be fair, as soon as they have multiple thresholds. Like 3 thresholds or 4 thresholds, Sinkhole's a big deal.
But yeah, like I was saying earlier, right? Like every mana counts in this deck, and as soon as you're down one, it starts getting really awkward real quick.
Yeah, and it's another reason why Avatar Bear is so good, just because effectively it's mono-aware, so it's free to include, and it's just totally like, and Bells are totally crazy good, and they're just even more crazy good with Sinkhole. So between it being a free include, and yeah, I don't know, it's just another card that it's a free include, it's generally pretty good, and then it's crazy good with Bells. And it's crazy good just generally on the play as well, in any deck that's like reasonable tempo and can just drop, play the Sinkhole, drop a threat, and then blow up a thing. It can be quite a big tempo.
It's a super trap card.
We went out for dinner after with Luca and Nigel.
Nigel is dad.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, Luca's father, Nigel, right?
Who also top-aided.
Yeah, he had a good tournament as well. And we get along. I mean, obviously we didn't go out for dinner with them because we don't get along with them.
Yeah.
Like, we get along with them really well. Like, we get along with quite a lot of people there, but for whatever reason, just get along with them, like, really, really well. It feels really easy to talk to them. It's really good that I feel like, I don't know, it's really good that it's something that they're not the only father-son. Like, I think the guy you played in the semi-final as well, right? They're another father-son that plays.
I beat his kid in round 1 as well.
Okay. But I don't know, there's something about it, it's just like, it's pretty cool to see for whatever reason. With the father-son thing happening, going out there playing, I feel like it's just...
Yeah,
it's not always going to be the easiest thing when you have, like, obviously you're going to have an age gap, obviously, because literally one's a father and one's a son, and to find things that you can do like that for a whole entire day that you can both really enjoy and do together or whatever is, like, super cool.
It does also feel like Sorcery in general, at least in Australia, like, it's really accommodating to them, to, like, that sort of thing as well, because, like, you don't have the real, dickhead people like they do in some other games where it's just not a good environment to bring your kids, sort of thing. Whereas this one, everyone's just super nice, gets along, pretty good. Everyone's there to just have a good time, and
Yep, that's definitely that's definitely a thing. Hopefully it's something that maintains that way over the course.
Yeah, hopefully.
Because it does feel like, I don't know, there's something about it.
Fair,
it's nice.
Pretty much all the people I've interacted with that came in from other games are like, oh yeah, I've just started playing this, and like from another game, and they've all been pretty nice. So maybe it just attracts the people that are a bit nicer. Who knows?
Yeah. I don't know. It's not. I don't know what it is about. I don't know why or what it is about the game exactly that. On the face of it, it's nothing about it that. Maybe there's something about it. I don't know, but I don't know what it is that makes it so that these dickheads or whatever, as you say, like these unfriendly, unpleasant people, why they wouldn't play the game, if you know what I mean. Like, it feels, it doesn't feel like for some reason they wouldn't want to play it. So I don't know what. Maybe they will in the future. Unfortunately, I don't know.
Yeah, who knows? Yeah, maybe it's just small enough still that those people haven't come into the space yet, but
maybe I can guarantee you that those people existed in Magic the Gathering in its early days.
Yeah,
when it was still small and there wasn't really anything much going on, if you know what I mean. Like, and they pretty much existed in anything I've ever done in my entire life that involves any form of competitiveness, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
Whether that's playing any kind of game or any kind of sport or any kind of anything that has a competitive element, there's always those people, you know what I mean? Yeah. So
that just the extreme, and
don't know, but hopefully
maybe it's like that at the other tournaments. Who knows?
Yeah, maybe it'll be interesting just to know in other places whether it's like that or not. But
Definitely not here.
So I guess we'll just go through some cards that didn't end up making the cut to the deck. Well, I think all of these were part of the deck throughout the process. They were tried, and
Pretty much.
they were tried at various points, and they didn't end up making the cut, or in the final list, let's say. It's less about the cut, really. Like, it's not like these are the cards and you cut something, they didn't make it, right? It's more complicated than that, right? Like, it's obviously. But these are cards that we tried. They didn't ultimately end up in the deck, but they were tried, so we thought we'd discuss them to, because it's useful to know not only why the cards that are in the deck are in the deck, but why the ones that aren't in the deck, why they're not, can be, from a knowledge standpoint, it's pretty interesting for some of these, right? I think we'll start with just Earth, generally. Why is Earth not in the deck? And I guess in particular, the main things that... There are other Earth cards, like some, but the bread and butter of the Earth and the Deathspeaker deck really is the Land Surveyors and Common Sense, and a Common Sense package, and the Common Sense to access a Common Sense package is the main stuff that Earth would bring to a Deathspeaker deck. Obviously, some of them run a Retanus Titan and Earthquake and other bits as well, right? But I'm sure that the primary reason for Earth's inclusion is the Land Surveyor, right? The Land Surveyors.
Yeah.
And the access to being able to run a Common Sense package. So I think it's... Why is Earth not in this deck? Is something like the question, why is Common Sense not good in this deck? Why is Land Surveyor not good? And why don't you want to run Earth? And I mean, the obvious thing here is just, you need consistency, and Land Surveyors generally help a lot of decks that are running them with the consistency, right? Because they help you draw the sites and help you find the sites for the thresholds and so on and so forth. But with this deck, there's so many double and triple thresholds, especially for water and for air. Like, you have so many thresholds, and you just gotta have a whole bunch of water sites and a whole bunch of air sites. And
also, a big part of the consistency for Land Surveyor for other decks is just playing those sites over multiple turns. Whereas this deck, when you're comboing out, Land Surveyor doesn't really draw you a card because it draws you a site when that's not where there's a good chance you just will never get around to playing those sites with this deck unless they're like in your early few turns. But they hinder you when you're trying to combo out.
Yeah, exactly. So they're just not, I mean, in this deck in particular, they're just not as good as Cores.
Yeah,
they're just not as good as Cores. They're also not particularly good at all if the Earth splash is so minor that you can't even potentially cast them when they're in the first few turns. I think it's just the card's not that great at all in this deck. I mean, part of it is, though, like, realistically speaking, you couldn't run 4 elements. We had to cut one, at least one. We were sort of trying to cut the fire out at one point as well. But in the end, the fire is just way more valuable than the Earth, broadly speaking, right? Because it gives you Death Dealer primarily, right? But also the Violence.
Good ways to kill.
Yeah, and the Poison Novas are huge as well in this deck. Like, in the end, the fire does so much heavy lifting that we did look at wanting to cut it to help with the consistency, and we had that conversation more than once, and in the end, it just couldn't do it.
Yeah, and a big reason why the Poison Novas are so good, and you can't just play Earthquakes instead of them, is because of all the water sites, where your Earthquakes just don't work on your own sites.
If there was to be Earth in this deck, there would be so few Earth thresholds that you wouldn't be able to cast the Land Surveyors consistently, and it would mess with just generally being able to cast. Like, it would hurt the consistency so much for a card that the deck just kind of doesn't need, and also just isn't very good at all, as you describe it. Even if the Earth thresholds were free, even if you just magically had them for whatever reason, you still wouldn't play the Land Surveyor anyway. But part of that is
maybe
also
if they were free, you would still play them, but it would be hard to make work.
I know,
because it's not like they're in the first 2 or 3 turns when you're getting going. But the difference between drawing a sight and a spell then isn't that, because there's turns where you have to draw a sight for your turn, and they fill that role better than Apprentice Wizard.
Sure.
But as soon as you're into the mid and late game and you actually need to combo when you're doing your combo, they just don't do anything.
Other than totally break your combo and maybe lose you the game. I mean, I think a big part of it, though, as well, is just that, obviously, like, we realized pretty early on, because of all of the water and air threshold requirements, if you're going to play water, air, and fire, and you're going to have these threshold requirements, you're not playing Earth, basically. It just can't be done.
It's also another big draw to even play Earth is to play Common Sense, whereas the shuffling effect in this deck is actually quite detrimental.
Very.
So, like, that even turns you off from even wanting to play them in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah, so So at that point, it's like the Common Senses aren't, well, they're bad, but the shuffle effect is horrible. It's horrific, pretty much.
Yes.
You wouldn't play between not playing the Common Senses and, I'm not even sure. I mean, the thing is with the Land Surveyors, it's like so much stuff would. The thing is, you don't get to play them for free, right? So that statement is a little bit, doesn't really mean anything, that statement. And the deck has just evolved to become a deck that is to be a Deathspeaker deck that just doesn't need to draw the sights off the Land Surveyors, right? Like, we've solved the mana requirements other ways.
Yeah.
We've solved them with all of the cores and the stone and the replication and having all the wizards to pass around to get all the discount. Like, the mana requirements have just been solved that the Land Surveyor provides have just been solved in a completely different way. And that completely different way is an integral part of the whole entire... It's the whole entire reason, to some degree, why this is a completely different deck archetype, right?
Yes.
And it's also a big reason why the water's so key and all the mermaid, like all the submerged stuff is so key, is because you do not want like 4 cores and 3 Philosopher's Stones and a Manuscript or whatever all just sitting together on the surface of a site to be 8 for 1 with a disenchant. And then outside of those 2 cards, realistically, like if you just don't want to play the Land Surveyors and you just don't want to play the Common Sense, you're definitely not splashing.
All the other Earth cards aren't worth playing.
I mean, the Earthquakes are just borderline useless in this deck as well, so you're not going to play those. So at that point, you're like, what, you're going to splash Earth so that you can play, what, exactly? A Retanus Titan? Or something? Like, it so just doesn't make any sense.
Dispel instead of Disenchant.
Yeah, okay. So I think in the end, it's just, the reason why Earth isn't in this deck, in summary, really, is just because the main things you would want are Common Sense and Land Surveyor, and you don't want to shuffle the deck. You don't want the Common Sense, basically. And the thing is, as well, particularly with this deck, is that it's capable of drawing the whole deck. And if you draw the whole deck, you have whatever Common Sense package you have, you're holding all of it in your hand.
Yes. And
also, you have the added advantage of your Common Sense package, if you even want to call it that, can be any rarity. It can be all uniques if you want. Because if you draw your whole deck, you have your whole deck, irrespective of what the rarity is. We kind of do have a Common Sense package in a way with all of these one-offs, right? Like, the Disenchant is in a way part of the Common Sense package.
But we only play one.
Yeah, exactly, right? But so you only have one Heat Ray and only one Disenchant, but when you combo to win the game, you have them both, right? You have all of your answers because you have all of your deck.
Yep.
The fact that you can draw your whole deck somewhat renders Common Sense mute anyway. You don't need to find a specific card when you found every card. So I think that's just, at its core, it's just you're not playing Earth really because the deck just doesn't want any of the cards that Earth has and that you would typically play in a Deathspeaker deck. But also, a big part of the reason for that is because the deck has just, it's evolved in such a way to solve all of the problems that the Earth was solving in different ways, basically, right? Like, the deck has evolved to not have Earth, pretty much, right? Throughout its life cycle as we were building it. Not having the Land Surveyors was a problem, right? Not having Common Sense, not having these cards was a problem, did create problems for the deck, and there were problems that we ultimately ended up having to solve in various ways.
Yeah.
Including, for example, the combo cycle being good enough and consistent enough to be capable of drawing your whole deck. Because if you didn't draw your whole deck, then you weren't guaranteed to find the Disenchant and the Heat Ray and everything, right? A lot of the reason why these other cards that we'll discuss were ultimately cut because they had a negative impact on your ability to draw your whole deck up. They hurt with the combo like that. It's not necessary. Well, we'll talk about them, but it's not necessarily that any of these cards were bad as such, and they all could have probably been included, but the reason why they weren't is just because it's just mostly that, right? They were just like cards that didn't help you draw your whole deck when you were comboing, and didn't do enough outside of that to justify it, basically. So anyway, we'll move on from Earth. I think at its core, that's pretty much it, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think that's enough there. Observatory. This is a card that when we're building multi-element decks that include air, especially 3-element decks that are doing fancy things like control type decks, we're having a conversation between, like, there are only so many single air threshold cards you can possibly include, and normally it's like not many, like 3, and normally you're just doing one of each tower. But we do have the conversation whether there should be observatories as part of that mix, or an extra site that's an observatory. Like, it's a conversation we have, and some decks observatories are better, some decks towers are better, sometimes a mix is better, sometimes you want both, etc. But the observatory is a shining star in decks that have a lot of shuffle effects, where you can play it, do the genesis, look at the next 3 spells, put however many it is that you want to keep it on top in whatever order, and then shuffle it at the exact point where you've drawn whichever cards you want, which may be none, right? Like, you just play it, look at the next 3, you don't want any of them, and then you common sense straight after, or some other shuffle effect. Observatory is absolutely fantastic when you have a lot of shuffle effects, but this deck doesn't have, well, it has one shuffle effect, and it purposely sort of is avoiding them all. So because of that, it's not very good in this deck. And also, as we discussed when we were talking about the towers, that their mana from the towers are just really powerful at all points in the game. Is there anything else on the observatory?
I think that's about it. The only other interaction in this deck in particular is like potentially with browse, but even then, it's not relevant enough to be sacrificing a single threshold site for.
Yeah, okay. So with browse, what's the...
So like you look at the top 3, you know, and then you know exactly when you want to, you know. So you say you only want one card, you just draw one, and then you browse to go the extra cards deeper, basically, to get more value out of your browse.
Sure. Yeah, and it's not a particularly, doesn't feel as good as the Mermaids interaction.
Certainly not as, you know, certainly not super strong, but it's, you know, it's an interaction that exists.
But in the end, it's just nowhere near as good as the towers in this deck, pretty much, in the end, right?
No, not even close. And like, it's by magnitudes as well.
The Geistwood, I'll let you lead this one.
So it's, you know, similar issues with the Observatory, where like mana is, you know, the thresholds are important. So already, you know, it's very hard to find room for sites that have no thresholds at all. This deck in particular, because you want your starting location to be a water site, and you also want all of your minions to be on that site, well, your wizards, you know, mostly, in Mermaids as well, you can't just load them all up on a Geistwood. You also don't have the ability to, like, put your minions on a Geistwood and then kill them outside of, like, the 2 Violimps and the Manuscript. So that's also another very awkward... It's just a little bit too awkward in this deck. Because it's not like most other Deathspeaker decks where you can just like sort of put it in front of you, play all your minions there. Maybe half of them will die on it, the other half will have to block somewhere else, and it's not much of an issue. Here, you really need to be working on your home site, building out everything there. So,
yeah, I mean, and even in these other Deathspeaker decks that you're referring to, it's not even an auto include in them anyway. There's plenty of lists that doesn't include it.
Yeah,
I mean, there's plenty that do, but there's also plenty that don't.
Yeah, it's hard to make work. In the best use I managed to, you know, work out how to use it is in like a 2-element Deathspeaker deck of just fire air, and in that it's actually very good. But outside of that, it's a bit hard to make work and stretch the mana base for.
This is one of the ones that I'm sure we talked a lot about. This one, I know, throughout the Dream Quest. It was one.
Yeah, not only for this deck, we've been talking about this card back and forth for...
It's a card that's got us in a weird spot
before the last tournament.
Yeah, it's one we keep looking at it. We keep talking about it for hours, and we keep talking, and then we keep not playing it.
Keep pushing back on.
we ultimately just keep not playing it. But it's a card that just, for whatever reason, it's just like, I think at its core, it's like, there are decks that we build. This is a great example of such a deck, right? Where if you cast it and it resolves, you won the game, probably. Whatever percentage you had of winning the game, like, just went up by some massive amount because it resolved in certain decks. And this is absolutely one of them. The idea that if you've got your Plague of Frogs cast, you've got 7 frogs sitting under there or whatever, and then you resolve a Dream Quest and you can grab the Manuscript and then just draw 7 cards. Like, you just won the game, right, at that point. The idea where you have certain decks that if they just get a specific card, they can do big, crazy things. Which isn't all decks, but it's certainly some decks. And whenever we have those decks, we always keep looking at this card. But I think it's just...
it's unnecessary. And it's like... My big issue with it, in this deck in particular, is you already have effectively no targets for any removal in somebody's deck. So as soon as you play it, they're going to be sitting there with a handful of removal, and they go, okay, hey, let's go, let's kill that one power wizard or 0 power wizard. That's going to be hard to kill.
And it'd be very hard to build a deck that has the spellcasters, that has this, that has things that it wants to fetch with it, but also has put down a whole bunch of other stuff beforehand that they've used all of this removal on.
Yes.
Like, I'm not saying it's impossible, by the way, but nothing's coming to mind, let's put it that way.
I do know this. Someone tried to play Dream Quest against me in the tournament, and they were not happy with the result.
Yeah.
They got Atlantean Fated and lost like their whole board and a Dream Quest.
I think it's just too hard to resolve with the current card pool. I think in the end, that's the issue. Maybe there's some card that somehow helps to be able to resolve it, but right now there isn't any reasonable way to be able to like protect the thing, right? Like, there's a lot of things you can do that help a bit, but there's nothing really that's just reliable that you would want to play. I don't even know what's reliable. Is there even anything reliable at all?
There is.
If you wouldn't want to play it?
Some artifact. It looks like a tree. I can't remember.
Is it the Gilded Aegis? Or the Blasted Oak?
Yeah, it might be the Blasted Oak.
But even that's only stuff that targets, so it wouldn't stop it going from something that doesn't target.
Yeah, but even that's a unique card as well. So, you need a unique card to protect your unique card.
Yeah, but even that doesn't protect. I mean, it doesn't stop some random minion attacking and killing it. It doesn't. Yep. It doesn't stop a projectile hitting. It doesn't stop firebolts. It doesn't stop. I think the issue with Blasted Oak generally is just that it doesn't do enough, anyways, right? Even outside of Dream Quest, because I think it's only stuff that targets. A lot of stuff doesn't target.
Yeah, it has to have the word actually target in it, so it's like a lot of ways of getting around that.
I mean, you realistically look at for example, if you're just looking at our own deck list, right? It doesn't stop it being Poison Over. It doesn't stop it being Heat Raid. It doesn't stop it being Grapple Shot. Like, it doesn't stop it dying to a Vile Imp. Like, it doesn't literally save it from anything in the entire deck.
It does stop at Vile Imp.
It does stop a
Vile Imp target.
Vile Imp can't what, sorry?
It does stop Vile Imp.
How?
Because Vile Imp is target adjacent unit.
Yeah, but so it would only do it if the Blasted Oak, if there's a unit that is where the Blasted Oak is, and that is adjacent to the Vile Imp also. Otherwise, I wouldn't, right? But probably wouldn't. Am I not understanding Blasted Oak correctly?
Let me read this again.
It just, if a spell or non-basic ability can target in order of
so your Vile Imp can't actually target Blasted Oak. Yeah, okay.
This side or location or anything else there. So if there is another minion at the same side as Blasted Oak, if that minion is also adjacent to the Vile Imp when it's summoned, then you would have to target that other minion.
So I had misread Blasted Oak to be better than it was, and it was still shit.
Yeah, it's not very good at all. And it's certainly not going to help you resolve your Dream Quest reliably.
No.
So yeah, I mean, it does in many ways. It's just like this deck is almost like the dream deck for Dream Quest in many ways, right? Because if it ever does resolve, you probably just won the game, right? And there's a lot of decks where like if it resolves, it's great, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you've just won the game then and there. But this deck,
to me, it's like it's such a risk to try and get it to even resolve that it's like you may as well play something more consistent. Generally, my feeling towards that card in this deck in particular, because you're probably going to get there to draw your whole deck anyway. Most of the time, it takes up space as well. Like space is at an absolute premium in this deck.
I just thought I found out the way that you could get it to resolve, but you could cast it and then you could cast the courtesan, but then they get to choose which card you get. Lol. So.
Well, no, they can still. Oh yeah, because you take their turn.
You take their turn to make sure you don't interrupt it or whatever, but then they take your turn and then they get to choose the card.
They get literally the perfect card to completely cut you with.
It's pretty funny, but at least you get to resolve your Dream Quest and lose to it. But I think that's the thing, right? Even if the spellcaster has burrowing, it dies when it falls asleep. Yeah, I
was like, it's a submerged spellcaster, but it disables itself and it kills itself. From when it's under there. It's just really hard to protect.
I mean, at the moment, the only way. I mean, we did discuss it, but it's just like if you have the like Phantom Steed or something, right, and then it carries a spellcaster into the void, and then you can cast it on the spellcaster that's in the void, because it's on target, and then they probably can't interrupt it. But you have to play Phantom Steed, which is pretty bad.
Yeah, it's two cards that do completely nothing by themselves, and Dream Quest does even less than nothing by itself.
So, but I mean, if Phantom Steed was just like a good card that you,
if
it would be a different conversation. If Phantom Steed,
it's a good card.
Yeah, if it was just a good card, it would be. So, but I guess somewhere in here is maybe the card's playable in the future because there's a card like Phantom Steed that helps you resolve it, but he's actually just a good card. I'm not saying
it's always going to be a bad card. Yeah. It obviously does a very powerful thing, but it's just very hard to make work.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's just, this is almost in many ways like not the perfect deck to help it resolve. It almost, I don't even know what that deck is. It's just, like we're saying, I feel like that's just an impossible task just about. But it is, I mean, probably the closest you just about get is having like a, having it on a Cloud City or something, right? And putting it, but even then they can still just bury it or whatever, right? It's like
or lightning bolt it or a million other ways.
I don't know. It doesn't feel like there's any really good deck that's very good at all in regards to helping it resolve, or at least having it resolve reliably. But as far as having it actually resolved and that helping you win, it's like there wouldn't be many decks that it's going to be more powerful than this deck.
No, because it probably results in you drawing the rest of your deck.
And even then, it doesn't make the cut.
Yeah.
Even though it costs 1 and has a single threshold, and even though it basically says if this resolves, you will probably win the game, it still doesn't make the cut to the deck, right? Which is sort of saying it's a little bit too easy to interrupt it, pretty much.
Yeah.
And a little bit too hard to make work. But I really like the art as well on that one.
It's going to be us doing this podcast. We're on what, hour 8?
Yeah. Evil. We'll move on. Evil Presence.
Yeah, so we touched on it a bit earlier, but I do think it's one thing we didn't touch on with Evil Presence. I don't think is the addition of like if you do play it, you possibly get to play Grim Reaper as well. But even then, they both feel not quite worth it. There's certainly other Jinn combo decks where Evil Presence is better than Summoning Sphere, but this one isn't it. Because we just have the cards, we don't need the less cards, we have no other spirits. Reaper would be the only other one we'd even consider, and that's, if you're only playing one presence and doesn't really feel worth playing the Reaper. I mean, the Reaper gets a little bit of extra value because we're playing Grapple Shot as well, but yeah, end of the day, Reaper doesn't do quite enough to not be part of a combo.
Yeah, I mean, it does it, like you're saying, it does it does this mini combo, or whatever you want to call it, with Grapple Shot, right?
Yeah.
But it's just, at the end of the day, you pull off the Grim Reaper Grapple Shot, fine, but you didn't.
Yeah, I mean,
it doesn't necessarily just win you the game because you did it, right?
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
So it's just some nice play that does something, but it's not a game-winning play, and pretty much like every card in this deck is either part of a game-winning play or it's just part of the engine to draw the deck, right?
Yes.
Or it's just part of the removal package, right? And then at that point, if Grim Reaper's in the deck, it's basically part of the removal package. That's how it has to be conceptualized. And it's just way less reliable than like Poison Nova and whatever, right? So it's not a bad card. There's other Deathspeaker decks that are running like double Evil Presence, double Jinn. And if you do have double Evil Presence, double Jinn, you probably do have a Grim Reaper for sure, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's fair. That's
so
cool.
I think it's just in this deck, you're definitely not playing it unless you're playing Evil Presence. And then the Summoning Sphere, again, you only need one because you draw your whole deck. You're not going to have one of each or anything. And the Summoning Sphere is just... And you have all the cards, so it's just... It doesn't make any sense that you would run Evil Presence effectively.
Yeah.
Because all the problems that card's trying to solve don't exist for this deck.
And we do even sort of have the second backup Summoning Sphere anyway in Grapple Shot, and that's just better than Evil Presence in this deck in particular. So
yeah. Firebolts.
It's just worse Heat Ray for what we want it to do. Effectively,
I think so. I mean, Heat Ray is just an amazing finisher in this deck because it's a guaranteed finish if you've just drawn your whole deck up and have it, because you also will have a wizard. And you can get
and
every
if we
single
wanted the extra, if we wanted the extra board control card, we'd just be playing the Vile Imps anyway. So
yeah, depending on what you want to do, Heat Ray or Vile Imp is just better. In a different world where you're running common sense, right? Like Firebolts is obviously really good in all sorts of situations, but it's more of a card that is good to solve random situations at some point in the game that isn't the end of the game, probably, right?
Yes.
If you run in Common Sense package, then you can get it at those points, right? Whereas with this deck, you're only really guaranteed to have it when you drew your whole deck and you're comboing, right? And then you want stuff that either is going to let you draw your whole deck and do 20 damage to them in one turn, or you want something that's guaranteed to kill them on their store the following turn. And Heat Ray's just way better for that, basically. That end part where you drew your whole deck up, Heat Ray's just better. I think part of the reason why Firebolts is... I mean, it's a really good card, Firebolts. And Heat Ray isn't necessarily at all better than Firebolts in all sorts of other decks. But in this specific deck, the Heat Ray is the guaranteed finisher. And you're guaranteed to have it because you'll have your whole deck.
Yeah. The Heat Ray is only there to kill them. So if we're going to play Firebolts for that same reason, then Heat Ray is just strictly better at doing that one specific job.
Yeah, as your semi-finalist opponent knows.
Yeah.
Pretty much. There is something there, which is something like Firebolts in this type of deck is just not a very good card if you don't have common sense to be able to fetch it.
It also makes your Poison Novas worse.
Yep.
And Lightning Bolt falls under that same category, except it's just also just straight up worse than Firebolts in almost all scenarios. There is the very fringe scenario where Lightning Bolt can kill someone on a Cloud City where Heat Ray couldn't get there, but that's about it.
Yeah, or you're killing a stealth thing or whatever, right?
Yeah.
There are fringe scenarios, but...
Yeah, but I mean, that's not why Heat Ray's there either. You know, it's not there to kill stealth stuff, so... But yeah, it is.
But it's a similar type thing, right? Like, Lightning Bolt is just not as good if you don't have common sense, because when those fringe scenarios happen, you can't just common sense and grab it and solve the problem.
Yeah, it's also, this deck in general just isn't trying to go one for one and just outvalue your opponent, right? It's, you know, you just hold off and don't die for a few turns, and then your whole deck's in your hand all of a sudden, and then you kill them, is the aim. So you got to be doing something real good if you have to go one for one, and that's like the Changelings and things like that, where they can go 2 for 1 or 3 for 1.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a general strategy, right? Where like you don't want to trade one, like you're saying, you don't want to kill their stuff. Yeah. You don't want to trade 1 for 1. You're just looking to stall and have chump blockers, and then board wipe them with a Poison Nova or a Death Dealer, pretty much. Like that's the general strategy. lightning bolts and firebolts and whatever. They're like anti-synergistic.
They just slow your combo.
And they also are. They're not bad finishes. They're okay, but they're not as good. They're not anywhere near as good as Heat Ray.
Yeah.
Especially in this deck. Like, this deck in particular, like, Heat Ray is generally a really good finisher. But in this deck in particular, it's basically a guaranteed finisher pretty much because you can cast the wizard on whatever, on any file, right? So you will be able to hit them with the Heat Ray unless it's some really obscure situation. Like, that probably involves the Cloud City.
Pretty much.
Occult Ritual. This is an interesting one.
And this one is actually pretty good because of the way, but it's only ever good when you're comboing off. And most of the time when you're comboing off, you don't really need it. There's definitely fringe scenarios where, like, it would allow you to keep going on a turn where you cast a Grandmaster Wizard and potentially draw your whole deck like one turn earlier. But there's also all the games where it's just a dead card until you're comboing off. And most of the time when you're comboing off, you don't need that little bit of extra help. You're better off playing a card that is going to get you to the point where you can combo off. But yeah, it's certainly not a bad card. But very much a win more card.
I don't know. It like you said, it very much feels like a win more card in that. That's part of it, and the other big part of it is that it really is just a completely dead card in all sorts of situations. It doesn't do anything at all. Whereas there are other cards that don't do much. They're not that good at all. But like Replication is another example, right? Like Replication can be a completely dead card. But the Occult Ritual is a completely dead card way more often than the Replication, right? And also the Replication is way more important and way more powerful, the effect.
Yes. Yeah, the upsides of Replication are like far higher than the upsides of Occult Ritual. And it's a dead card way less.
Yeah, like the ceiling is way higher and the floor is way higher, basically, right?
Yeah.
I think it's just to illustrate, right? Like the Replication is just a way better card for this deck than Occult Ritual. You're never gonna like drop a Replication for an Occult Ritual or whatever. So it's just a card that you would have additional, and like Replication is almost like the best example of a card. A Disenchant could be dead, but there aren't many cards in this deck that are just guaranteed completely dead, right? But there are a few. Is it just Summoning Sphere? Nimbus Jinn doesn't feel good to jam it before you combo, but
I suppose just to explain why a Summoning Sphere can be dead is like if they're playing an avatar that's just on your side of the board. But even in those scenarios, it's not even realistically dead because there's potential they could, you put in the death's door and then they go all the way back over to their side like an avatar event just pushes them away.
I didn't mean dead when you're I didn't mean dead when you're going off and you're drawing your whole deck. I just meant like you could be holding it like in turn 4 or something and you can't use it.
Oh yeah,
like
okay,
on your 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 drop or whatever. Like you're not using it until you win.
In that case, Jinn is also a complete dead card because you realistically you can't play that card unless you're like
you have
completely locking in on just I'm using the alternate win condition to win, but that alternate win condition has to be guaranteed to win because otherwise you just can't kill anyone.
But sometimes you just don't have a choice, right? Like because you just lose a game if you don't play it, so you got to play it.
Yeah.
So it can actually save you from losing the game, and then maybe you win. Probably you don't from that position, but it's close. Like it's less dead than Summoning Sphere and Occult Ritual kind of thing, but it's pretty dead still, right?
Yeah.
So and then obviously if you don't have any artifacts, then Replication is pretty dead. And like again, like ideally you're not casting Heat Ray, using it as a finisher, but again, like you could cast it earlier, right? You don't have to save it. You've got other ways.
Because there's enough other cards that do kill them on death's door that it's not like boom or bust.
And there are certain situations that can just arise where like it can just do a lot of work, right? Like you could 3-for-1 them.
Yeah, you could kill something on like every square and it goes through.
And importantly, one of those could potentially be like your own Grandmaster Wizard or Simulacrum or whatever, right? And you could then recast it that same turn as well, potentially.
Yeah.
Like, so there's cards that are completely dead because you just can't play them early or before the end of the game. And then there's, which isn't many, right? It's just Summoning Sphere. And really, because even Replication is like, I don't know, there are so many artifacts that even when it's dead, it's not dead for long. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So even Replication isn't kind of that dead. Whereas Dream Quest is very much in the summoning sphere type of dead category, right? Like, it doesn't do anything at all until it does its thing, and it doesn't do anything other than its thing. Do you know what I mean? And it's even probably less flexible than Summoning Sphere, quite frankly. Because at least Summoning Sphere, you can still just drop it somewhere and drop a Vile Imp directly on top of it. Like, there are fringe scenarios where it just does something random before the end of the game, right?
Yeah, well, it lets you play like a Selfsame Simulacrum on their Grandmaster Wizard, for instance.
But there are not, you know, and I guess conceivably there are also fringe scenarios for the Occult Ritual, but they must be incredibly fringe that you would want to actually play that before you're sort of going off with your combo.
Yeah, well, I mean, you'd have to.
Fringe.
So the worst case scenario where it's fringe and can be played outside of being a complete dead card is if you have two wizards, or even just one wizard hanging out with your avatar, right? And then it generates 2 mana.
Yeah, so to power into whatever, right?
Yeah.
To power into something you have to do, otherwise you lose. Or maybe it's fine to power into a Great Old One with that play, actually. Yeah. But outside of that, you know, it's probably just because you got a board wipe and you just have to, you know, you're short to do your Death Deal or a Poison Nova or whatever. So you just got to do it. Yep. So, but they'd be pretty fringe, those scenarios, I imagine.
It's certainly the sort of card where it'd be an amazing card to go get with an Eric's Curiosa.
Yep. It'd be on your little binder of 100 cards you might possibly want to get with it if it was in your deck.
Yeah.
I think ultimately though it's just because it doesn't do anything outside of what it does, pretty much, right?
Yeah, really, it's not flexible.
It's just not yeah.
It just does that one thing.
And we just, you know, there are times where you just, you know, you draw that, it sits in your hand the whole game, it doesn't do anything at all, and arguably it just lost you the game. Because if you had just had other stuff, maybe you would have won.
And there's only so many of those sort of cards you can play.
There's only so many cards that can be, and we're really trying to make that number either 0 or as close to 0 as it possibly can be as well.
Yeah.
I think we've been really trying to make an effort of, like, if you've got these really narrow cards that only do one thing to solve some specific problem, we're really trying to, like, look at the whole deck as a whole, how it can solve those problems in other more versatile ways without having to run these really narrow cards. It's something that I think is something that...
Yeah, so I think one of the cards that sort of fits that description in this current list is Disenchant, right? Like, there's a clear problem that it's solving, and there isn't really any cards that can do that. So we just had to bite the bullet and say, all right, it just has to be Disenchant. Whereas, you know, all the other cards, you know, they sort of answer potentially 2 problems.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I guess, you know, Disenchant potentially does, it's pretty narrow, but I guess as we did, like, it's there for some specific cards, but it also just randomly does good stuff sometimes as well. And, like, there are certain matchups where, like, it doesn't... Yeah,
like Killer Jihad, when your opponent top decks Common Sense and can't get Violent.
Yeah, exactly, right? Or just getting rid of an Atlantean Fate could randomly... Like, there are certain auras where just getting rid of them could randomly do something. Of Silence as well, obviously, but there are random auras where just being able to get rid of them is just randomly good. It's there to get rid of Bells as well. And if you just, you know... It's never going to feel bad when you just get rid of, like, 2 or 3 Philosopher's Stone / cores, right? If they got a little stack of little stack of mana rocks on them, and you just get rid of all of them with one card, like, that's probably a game-winning play just there for any deck that's running all that stuff. Like, it's probably just too big a hit to lose it all. Like, it's probably buying you at least 1 turn, probably 2, probably more than 1, and that's probably enough for you to win just by doing that. It's pretty narrow, but it's not that narrow either. Do you know what I mean? There are certainly matchups where they just don't have any artifacts or auras, though, and it just doesn't do anything.
Yeah, but it is the narrowest card in the deck, realistically, outside of, like, specific combo pieces that only do their combo thing.
Yeah.
Everything else is sort of like, it can do something else. It's here for this reason, but, you know, it can do something.
Yep.
Whereas Occult Ritual just, it feels, it does less things than it only does its thing effectively.
Yeah, exactly. And because it's like unique and you can only run one and everything else, you can't even build the deck in such a way where you rely on getting that mana, right? Either.
Yeah.
So you have to build the deck where it can do its whole thing without that mana anyway.
It's like a luxury.
So yeah, I guess I'm just saying because you have to build the deck in such a way that it's functional without it, to some degree it means you don't need it.
Yeah, it functions without it.
Yeah. Wayfaring Pilgrim.
No, this one's actually an interesting one. And because it's, it does everything you want it to do, right? Like it costs 2, it draws cards. It's also, when you're comboing off, it's even better than most of your other cantrips because it's a fire cantrip and there's almost no fire cards in the deck. So there's
and it also only costs 2. So like you're more likely to...
2.
The discounts are more impactful because it's even cheaper, right? Like if you only have 1 stone, it costs 1 instead of 2, right? If you have 2 stones, it's 3 instead of 1. Like it's... The fact that it costs 2 instead of 3 is a big deal. That it's 1 cheaper as well. And that its fire threshold is a big deal. Those things are real big pluses for this card.
Absolutely. But I think the biggest issue with it is it's like you have to jam it all the way in the corner. So it's hard for it to even get back into your graveyard most of the time.
Well, it's not even that easy to get it in the corner with this deck to begin with. Not that easy because you're not playing the sites as fast either because you don't have the land. Like you're playing sites on turns 1, 2, 3 and then 5, 7, 9. Sometimes you have an extra one in there somewhere. But you're not guaranteed to... The way that the game plays out, you're not guaranteed to be in the corner that
And you can't really just force yourself to go 1, 2, 3 across the side and let your opponent do whatever they want with their sites, with this deck in particular as well. So it's like, it's just a little bit too awkward. Like, if it wasn't for that, it would be incredible in this deck.
I mean, you also...
Even if, realistically, if it cost 3 and didn't have the corner, like, and just drew a card, we would probably be in this deck. Like...
Probably, yeah.
Maybe, yeah. It'd definitely be a consideration, but yeah. Just that little bit too awkward. It's also like, it's a minion that if you're going off with Manuscript, it's not going to be... You can't really play it anywhere near your Manuscript as well.
Yep.
So quite a difficult...
You don't have, like, any ways for it to go from corner to corner. You don't have Magellan Globe, basically, right? To do that
it's always just going to be one card and then die and then...
Get another one. I mean, even dying is a bit of an issue when it's jammed in the corner as well, because this deck doesn't have any way to kill it, and if it's in the corner, it's being able to put itself to the forefront to guaranteed sort of block anything, which then creates another problem that it can't block anything, which doesn't have a lot of synergy with the chump block a bunch of stuff to be able to then poison over them, whilst this is off in the corner doing its own thing completely separate to everything else. Yeah, it has these massive pluses, but at the end of the day, it's not for this deck. But there definitely would be Deathspeaker decks where this would be great in, for sure.
Well, absolutely.
Just not this one, yeah. It's interesting, because this one doesn't actually say Genesis, even though it works. It's a card that works really good with Deathspeaker. And this one, I think I have seen in other Deathspeaker builds. So for whatever reason, this one has been picked, the Wayfaring Pilgrim has been identified as being good in Deathspeaker despite not saying Genesis, but the Selfsame Simulacrum hadn't been, for whatever reason. Sure. Pact with the Devil?
I mean, if we could get away with it consistently on the mana base, card would be so good in this deck. But yeah, we weren't really willing to play more fire sites. And maybe there's a version of this deck where, especially online, once you're not playing Great Old One because of Chaos Twister, all of a sudden, like, maybe you take out both the Island Leviathans and then you can tinker with the mana base more to get it in.
And then the grapple shot's also gone. Probably, and then all of a sudden there's like this big cascading list of changes, right, to the deck. So.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. But the reason it's not in here is just double fire. A little bit too hard to make work. But yeah, definitely a very strong effect. And I mean, you do sort of want to keep your wizards in play, it's not the biggest drawback, but it's a drawback that you're willing to do if you go to get those 3 cards. The turns to cast to do this and flashback a Grandmaster Wizard, unless you're like popping off with your cores, is pretty expensive. But
yeah, I mean, there are definitely differences for this deck. Like, as you said, you're happy to make the sacrifice, like sacrifice the wizard, so to speak. But
yeah,
it's a worse sacrifice in this deck than the average deck that would be running Pact with the Devil and Wizards, because you have the similar, like, whilst you're happy to sacrifice the Grandmaster Wizard, you're also not entirely unhappy to have a Grandmaster Wizard in play either, right? For
it is between the Simulacrum. It is also like, it's pretty good when you're going off though as well if you've got multiple stones out, because you can do your discounts with your wizard and then sacrifice that wizard, and then you end up using a fire threshold as well, like a fire discount as well, which is like incredible. But all that double red, quite difficult. Like, we're already pushing up for Death Dealer.
Yeah, I mean, there are games where
you lose because you just don't have the double fire threshold. So there's only so many of those cards you can play.
We definitely had games where you have the 7 mana, but you don't have the double fire threshold. It can happen.
Yep, for sure.
There are games where, like, you cast the Highland Princess and you really want to be getting that Philosopher's Stone, but you do have to get a Ruby Core because you just don't have a fire threshold. So
absolutely.
So yeah, I think the Pact with the Devil is also just, I don't know, like, if you potentially, like, you can't cast it when you have, like, it's not a given at all. In fact, it's probably the opposite of a given. It's probably going to not be the case that you can cast this as your 4-drop. You probably just do not have the double fire threshold. Like, that'd be
you have to consider it like Death Dealer, where it's like, it's a 7-drop maybe, but more realistically, it's like, a 9-drop sort of thing, unless you have the core.
Yeah, I think that just sums it up. Kind of amazing, kind of awesome. Just the thresholds are a bit of an issue, and didn't ultimately end up, because we're big fans of consistency. Is a big part of it. There's
definitely a greedy version of this deck where you just play it and you just hope, right? But that's not our style. We're more about the consistency.
Yeah, which is a big reason why the Occult Ritual is not in the deck as well, right? Like,
for sure,
it's just not part of our style to have a card that's completely dead, except when you're probably winning anyway, right? I do feel like the Pact with the Devil, though, is a little bit more, like, it is not necessarily a win more card, that one, though, right?
For sure.
Like, that one is definitely, like, maybe, like, it's definitely a win a game that you might have lost card.
Yeah, this one's sort of like a dream, like, if you pop this one off, it has a similar effect to a Dream Quest, where you probably just win if you cast it. So if we were going to put one of those cards in, it would probably be Pact, because it's just easier to get to work, but... Yeah, and again, it's space, right? Like, something has to come out. So it may as well be the inconsistent card.
Yeah, I mean, with Arthurian Legends coming out soon, it seems that there are sites with more mana fixing and stuff, so maybe there is some version of something or other where, who knows, basically. Like, I think of all the cards, this is the one where it's...
Would really like to get it in.
Yeah, well, out of all the cards so far, this is really the one where it's like, all the other cards, they didn't make the cut because they weren't effectively good enough, and in their own, you know what I mean? Like, we were choosing to not include them, right? Whereas this one was just like, we really desperately wanted it in the deck, and we really tried to change the mana base and make it work, and we really, really tried to just get it in there, but it just, in the end, it was just, the card just had to be sacrificed to help with the consistency of everything, really.
Yeah.
It was just a little bit too inconsistent, but like you said, there's a different... that's just us, I'm pretty sure the average deck that was going to do whatever like this, it's just in the deck, right? You just most of the time you just greedy. You just want to be greedy, and that was to some degree us a little bit more in the part. Like, it's definitely something that I've noticed that we've become increasingly, I don't know if more conservative is the word, but just more. There's just something that's changed. As we've got better at deck building in this game. Originally,
why I even moved to Geomancer last time was because I just wanted that more consistency and more, like, smooth gameplay, I guess. Not all up and down and losing to thresholds and stuff like that. So
of Thul?
I mean, it's definitely kind of thought about, but never. I don't think I ever even tested it. I just don't think it.
I mean, it's mostly on the list here because it's basically in every single Deathspeaker deck that runs water. So I just put it on the list because it's like, why isn't it here when every other one has it? And
realistically, it's just we just don't need what it does. Like, sure, getting in the 2 chip damage would be nice. You know, get to discard 1 less card, but it doesn't matter. Like at the end of the day, like you know, you just combo off and you'll probably have enough cards anyway. You never really need it for just like, say, having frogs on the surface and attacking for a bunch of damage. That's not going to put them to death's door. This is very much a binary deck of like, you know, just one-shot them and then you need to be able to kill them on death's door. And Ruler of Thul, you know, sure, you can kill people on death's door, but Heat Ray's just better at it. And if you have your whole deck in your hand, then you don't need a bunch of different ways to do it when we already have, like, you know, the Summoning Sphere with an Imp. You have the Heat Ray, you have the Grapple. You know, there's more than enough ways.
I just think a big thing with, like, because we build a lot of, you know, be going through the deck, especially these Deathspeaker or just general control type decks, right? Like, there are lots of categories and lots of differences, but broadly speaking, as far as chip damage is concerned, there are sort of 2 types, really. There are those that are capable of getting in chip damage, and there are those that are not capable of getting in chip damage, for whatever reason. And this is just in the latter bucket, right? This deck is just not capable of getting chip damage in. It's possible you could get 2 in, and that's good if you can, but you're not just sneaking in 13 chip damage with this deck.
No.
You are permanently on the back foot, and you're permanently, like, trying to live as long as possible. You are never on the front foot until you're basically really on the front foot because you're comboing off and you're just doing all the damage in one turn, as you say, right? I think Rule of Thul shines a lot more in a deck that is capable of just getting in a whole bunch of sneaky chip damage.
Absolutely.
So I think that's the
when it has the option of being like surprise death's door out of nowhere, or you know, killing them on death's door. Yeah, that's where it really shines.
But as you said, it's just not something we ever tested. We never really ever considered. I just threw it on the list because it's, as far as I'm aware, it's basically an auto-include in every Deathspeaker list that includes water. So, Major Explosion?
I mean, Major Explosion sort of falls in a similar category to Ruler of Thul with the chip damage, right? Like, Major Explosion is quite good if you can get in early chip damage, or even just like, you know, use it as a sweeper but still get in a bit of chip damage on their avatar sort of thing. So it's, you know, it's sort of in that same category as like Poison Nova, except that way more expensive and we don't need the chip damage, so it's just not as useful realistically for this deck in particular as Poison Nova.
I mean, another big thing, because we did test it a bit for a while, so one thing I think in particular that I definitely noticed with it is that just the way that the game's played out, that you would quite often be hitting yourself with it. Just because you want all of your minions on top of you, and quite often when they're seeing certain things happening, they'll be wanting to kill your minions, and also because you do not play as many sites and stuff, right? Like the action in this deck is sort of congested. It's typically congested close to you, right? So there are situations where, like, in order to kill the thing you want to kill, you also have to kill some of your own stuff you don't want to kill, or hit yourself with it that you don't want to do, which makes it a bit worse as well.
For sure.
Yeah, like you said, just being able to randomly hit them for 5 or 7 or whatever, on top of killing something, it doesn't really do anything, hitting them for 5 damage or 3 damage or whatever. And I think part of the reason why they are typically on top of you is because it costs 7, right? Like, if you need this card to desperately kill something, like, you could be in a pretty bad spot needing to wait to 7 mana.
Yeah, a big thing with this deck is if you're... Generally, when you're getting up to those sort of mana ranges, it's either very, very late in the game, or you're sort of getting to the early stages of comboing off, and you know you're getting your discounts. You have like a few cores, And then, that's sort of when you're getting around to that major explosion point. And at that point, you don't really want to kill your wizards either, because you need them around for the swapping. So
yeah, I mean, this was really just, we did test it right, but it was in and out pretty quick.
Yeah, it's also got that dreaded double fire threshold.
Yeah, exactly. And again, you should look at it's literally the exact same cost as Death Dealer, right? And it's just like Death Dealer is just way better for this deck. It's just way better.
For sure.
I think the last card on this list, which is again, I think probably one of the more interesting ones to discuss, it's Wrath of the Sea, and this started as 2 of them in the deck, right? And then it eventually became 1, and then it eventually became 0. And
this one's been in since like the very beginning of it, even before it was even a Deathspeaker deck, and it was like a Wrath of the Sea, Island Leviathan, Magellan Globe deck.
I think one thing as well, just talk about the card, just broadly speaking, is that what it even does, because even that was quite difficult to find out. And even then, it's a bit not unclear. We're pretty satisfied with what it does based on the sources that we asked, but at the end of the day, if anyone else is to play this card, you definitely need to check whoever's running the event what call they're going to make with it. So effectively, there are 2 ways to read this card. There are well, there's more actually. There's more than 2 ways apparently, but there's 2 main ways to read this card. So one is flood all sites adjacent to a body of water this turn, as in flood all sites adjacent to a body of water this turn, or you're reading it as flood all sites adjacent to a body of water this turn. So, as in,
so the distinction is a single body of water or all bodies of water across the board.
Yeah.
Which ones are you flooding?
And a lot of people, or it seems the average person, like the majority of people are reading this as in like you choose a body of water,
a singular body
and then
of water,
you flood all sites adjacent. Like that's how they read it. But both ways are grammatically correct in English. It's just, like I said, it's kind of where you place the emphasis, right? Another way of thinking of it is something like people in a queue need to wait their turn. If you said a statement like that, you wouldn't. You would just assume you're making a broad comment about all people in all queues everywhere, right? They need to wait for their turn. Not that you're talking about that there's some specific queue that exists in the world that people in that queue need to wait for their turn, but everyone else in every other queue, they don't have to wait for their turn, right? So it's just a way to illustrate just the grammar behind it. It's grammatically correct both ways. You can interpret it both ways. So some would argue that, well, if they meant all bodies of water, why wouldn't they say all bodies of water? But you could also say if they meant that you're supposed to choose a body of water, why doesn't it just say that you choose a body of water as well, right? Like, that's part of it. And then it says, then submerge all minions and artifacts on water, which presumably means anywhere. Then submerge all minions and artifacts on water, right? So, like, just thematically speaking, it's super weird to pick a body of water and then you flood of sites adjacent to that, and then after that, all minions and artifacts that are on water anywhere in the whole board in any bodies of water are then all submerged. Like, that's super weird.
Yeah, so that's the big thing that makes me lean towards it's you flood everything next to a body of any water, like all bodies of water, everything next to that gets flooded basically because of that.
And there's also, I can't think what it's called, but it's just something like I think it's the golden rule, what they basically say with all the cards, which is just like part of it is like when you're unsure, it's just apply some common sense, and part of that common sense takes into account the cost of the card. So like if this card costs 7 with double water threshold, and you're going to read it as choose a body of water and then flood all sites adjacent to that body of water and then submerge all minions and artifacts on that body of water, this card is arguably the worst card in the whole game. Like, it's the same cost as Death Dealer. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's the same cost. Yeah. It's like anything else at that cost level is doing something way more impactful than that, right? And then in any case, like, we clarified it, and as far as the main rules people we care about on the online league, and as far as the person running the event we attended, Jesse, we checked with all of them, and they all agreed that it was basically the version where it's flood all sites adjacent to all bodies of water, or a body of water, any and all bodies of water, and then submerge everything, all minions and artifacts on water, right? And even when the card works that way, it's still not that great. Not good enough to make this deck anyway, right? That the thresholds aren't an issue. It has plenty of water sites to potentially mean that a whole bunch of stuff will get submerged. But in the end, it was still the case that when you needed to board wipe it, it was just too slow compared to Poison Nova, and it didn't necessarily feel great submerging all your stuff sometimes, but it wasn't that bad.
Yeah, that was sort of my biggest issue with it, was like the games where you either don't have a submerge minion, or you just have wizards and stuff lying around, and you don't really want to kill them. Like, they could just be blocking, or they could be setting up for your combo. There's all those sort of cases where it comes up where you're like, well, I don't really want to kill all my stuff. But, so the main combo with it, we should point out, is that it just turns on your Island Leviathans, right? Like, it's just straight up, if you have enough sites, you just play Wrath of the Sea. Doesn't matter what sort of sites they are, if depending on how you lay them out, you're pretty much guaranteed to flood all of them. Turn your Island Leviathans on. You've killed everything on their side of the board, so they can't even block your Island Leviathans. And you smack them, pretty much. And in any deck with chip damage, the 16 would probably be good enough to get them to death door, but, we can't do chip damage in this deck, so it just didn't really feel necessary.
Yeah, I mean, and importantly as well, like, everything that you said is absolutely great, but also the fact that you're killing, you may not have any Island Leviathans, but you still want to kill all this stuff, right? Like,
yeah. In
the end, it was just the Poison Novas just
felt better.
They're just better because they just basically cast 2 turns earlier, and those 2 turns earlier could easily be the difference between winning and losing.
And especially with Poison Nova as well, like, you can cast it off of one of your own wizards, and then that guy gets to live as well. So
yeah, and as you said, importantly as well, like, you can have a Philosopher's Stone and lose it, basically.
Yeah, or you just might not have a submerge minion, but you have like all your cores, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, well, now they're all turned off as well. I better start digging for a frog or a mermaid.
Yeah, sure. Yep. But I think on the whole, it's probably, at least with the version, because obviously this deck is a little bit like, it has got a whole bunch of artifacts that it doesn't want to lose, right? And this submerges them. But I think it's a card that
there's definitely some fun deck where you play this with Leviathans and things like that. You just one shot someone out of nowhere, but this one isn't it.
The biggest annoying thing about this card for me, if we ever play it in a deck, honestly, is just going to be the annoying debate that's going to unfold every time you play it, where they think the card works differently.
Yeah,
pretty much.
Yeah, I could certainly see that being a drama.
So, I mean, I think at least if you're playing an event in person, you check it with the rules judge, you know what I mean? Like, that conversation happens, the judge, whatever, right? Like, that's not an issue. I think it's a bigger issue if you're playing online against people, right? Because you're going to go through the process. You're going to go through it over and over and over again. They're not going to be happy every time. You're going to stall. You're going to have to ask in the rules channel. There may or may not be a judge available, or, someone available who knows what they're talking about. Even if there is, that person, they may not even have. There's no unified view on this card, how it works, basically.
Yeah, they really need to do a fact for it and just put it on there. Problem solved.
Yep. So I think this is a good spot to wrap up the podcast. Thanks for watching. Shout out to Jesse at The Winning Agenda, and thanks to him for giving us permission to use the footage from his live stream. There's a link in the description to the original video of this with the commentary from the top 8 of the Sorcery Midwinter Championship, so please do check that out. There's also a link in the description to the deck list on the Curiosa website, so feel free to check that out also. If you enjoy the content, please like and subscribe to the channel. If you click on the bell icon on the drop list, if you select all, it will ensure that you receive notifications when we release the next video. Until we see you then, keep safe, keep well, and keep enjoying your sorcery.